The heat lay thick over 2nd Street that morning, August 4th, 1892. The house stood narrow and dark, its shutters drawn against the breathless air. Inside, the parlour smelled of dust and horsehair upholstery, of old wallpaper and something else, something metallic and wrong. Bridget Sullivan climbed the back stairs slowly, her temples throbbing from the bad mutton they had eaten the night before. Somewhere below, a clock ticked. Somewhere closer, a door closed softly. In the sitting room, Andrew Borden lay upon the sofa in his shirt sleeves, his boots still on, one arm hanging toward the carpet. His face was unrecognisable. The blood had stopped flowing, but still pooled beneath him, dark and thick in the August heat. Upstairs, Abby Borden lay between the bed and the dressing table, her body fallen forward, her skull open to the bone. The house was silent now, except for the flies beginning to gather at the windows, and in the yard beneath the pear trees, Lizzie stood in her pale blue dress, perfectly still, her hands at her sides, waiting. Chapter 1. The House on 2nd Street. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever the hour may be where you rest. Oh yes, I invite you to drift backward with me, back through the decades, past the noise of this present age, into a time when gaslight flickered in narrow hallways and secrets lived longer in the dark. If you find comfort in these whispered histories, if you return to this place between sleep and memory, please do subscribe. Let us be companions in the shadows of the past. Tonight we journey to Fall River, Massachusetts, in the year 1892. The Gilded Age has polished America's surface to a bright shine, but beneath it, in houses like the one on 2nd Street, old hatreds ferment in scents. Let us step inside that house now, before the blood, before the screaming, and meet the people who lived there in the heat of that final summer. The house stood at number 92 2nd Street, a narrow clapboard structure wedged between similar dwellings in the working heart of Fall River. It was not a mansion, though the man who owned it could have afforded better. It was not squalid, though it lacked the modern conveniences that other families of similar wealth enjoyed. It was a house that seemed designed for economy and discomfort in equal measure, a place where money was kept rather than spent, where warmth was rationed and privacy was impossible. Andrew Jackson Borden owned the house, as he owned much else in Fall River. He was 70 years old in the summer of 1892, a man whose face had settled into the permanent expression of someone calculating cost. He had begun his life as an undertaker's apprentice, and had risen through shrewd investment and relentless thrift to become one of the wealthiest men in the city. He sat on the boards of banks. He owned mills and commercial properties. His fortune was estimated at $500,000, a sum that would have built him a fine home on the hill where Fall River's elite lived in spacious comfort. But Andrew Borden did not believe in spacious comfort. He believed in locks and ledgers. He kept the house on 2nd Street because it was paid for, because moving would cost money, because waste was sin and display was foolishness. The house had no indoor plumbing, no gas lighting, no telephone. Water came from a pump in the kitchen. Chamber pots were emptied each morning. At night, kerosene lamps were lit grudgingly and extinguished early. Andrew Borden walked to his office each morning and walked home for lunch each afternoon, his pockets heavy with keys, his mouth set in a line that discouraged conversation. He had been married twice. His first wife Sarah had given him 3 daughters before dying young. 2 of those daughters survived, Emma, born in 1851, and Lizzie, born in 1860. When Lizzie was only 3 years old, Andrew had married again. The second wife was Abby Durfee Gray, a plain woman from a modest family, 37 years old and grateful for the security of marriage to a wealthy man, even one as cold as Andrew Borden. Abby was not loved in that house. The daughters had been too young to remember their real mother clearly, but they had learned to resent the woman who took her place. Abby was stout and plain. She moved slowly through the narrow rooms, cooking the meals Andrew demanded, keeping the house as he required, speaking little and laughing never. She tried, in the early years, to mother the girls. They rejected her utterly. They called her Mrs. Borden. Never mother, never even Abby. They ate her food in silence and left the table without thanks. Emma was the elder and the sharper. She had a narrow face and a gift for coldness that matched her father's. She had no suitors, no friends to speak of, no life beyond the house on 2nd Street, except for the long visits she made to friends in Fairhaven, absences that sometimes stretched for weeks. She was 41 years old in 1892, a spinster by any measure. Her youth spent managing her father's household and nursing grievances that never healed. Lizzie was different, though perhaps not as different as she wished to appear. She was 32 years old, plain-faced but respectable, active in the Central Congregational Church, where she taught Sunday school and served on charitable committees. She belonged to the Christian Endeavour Society and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She visited the sick and read scripture to the elderly. She dressed well, or as well as her father's stinginess permitted, and carried herself with the dignity of someone who believed she deserved better than she had been given. But beneath the church-going respectability, something darker lived. Lizzie had been caught shoplifting twice in her 20s, petty thefts from local stores that her father had paid to keep quiet. She had sudden rages, moments when her face would harden and her voice would drop to something flat and dangerous. She quarrelled with Abby constantly, skirmishes over household matters that were really battles over territory and power. She had not spoken directly to her stepmother for years, communicating only through notes left on the kitchen table or messages passed through Bridget, the maid. Bridget Sullivan was the 5th inhabitant of the house, a 26-year-old Irish immigrant who had worked for the Bordens for nearly 3 years. The family called her Maggie, the name of the maid who had preceded her, because learning a new name required effort Andrew Borden saw no reason to make. Bridget slept in the attic, a small room under the eaves that baked in summer and froze in winter. She rose before dawn to light the stove. She scrubbed and cooked and answered the door and emptied the chamber pots. She was paid $4 a week and given Thursday afternoons off. She spoke with an accent the Bordens found useful when they wanted to pretend not to understand her. The house itself seemed designed to foster misery. The rooms were small and dark, the windows kept shuttered against the heat in summer and the cold in winter. The front door opened directly into the sitting room, which led to the dining room, which connected to the kitchen at the rear. A steep staircase climbed from the front hall to the 2nd floor, where 4 bedrooms opened off a narrow landing. Andrew and Abby slept in the front bedroom. Emma and Lizzie occupied rooms at the rear. The guest room stood between them, a space rarely used. Its door usually kept locked. There was no privacy in such a house. Footsteps on the stairs announced every movement. Voices carried through the thin walls and the heating grates. Everyone knew when everyone else rose and retired, when they used the chamber pot, when they wept or argued or sat in silence. The house held its inhabitants like a trap holds animals, forcing them into unwanted intimacy while denying them any genuine connection. Money was the constant subject and the constant source of pain. Andrew Borden was worth $500,000, but he lived like a pauper and expected his household to do the same. He bought the cheapest cuts of meat. He refused to install gas lighting or indoor plumbing. He kept the house cold in winter to save on coal. When Emma and Lizzie asked for allowances, he gave them tiny sums and questioned every expenditure. When they asked why he lived so meanly when he could afford better, he told them that a fool and his money were soon parted, that waste was wickedness, that they should be grateful for the roof over their heads. But the worst of it, the thing that poisoned the household beyond recovery, had happened 5 years earlier. Andrew had purchased a house for Abby's sister, a gift that cost several $1,000s. When Emma and Lizzie learned of this, their fury was absolute. Their father would give property to Abby's family, but nothing to his own daughters. Andrew had been forced to placate them by deeding them a rental property, but the damage was done. The daughters saw clearly that their stepmother had influence, that their father could be generous when he chose, and that they were less valued than Abby's relatives. After that, the house on 2nd Street became a place of pure hostility. Emma and Lizzie stopped eating meals with their parents. They took their breakfast and supper in the dining room while Andrew and Abby ate in the kitchen. They stopped speaking to Abby entirely. They began sleeping with their bedroom doors locked and hooking the locks from the inside. They whispered together in corners, united in their resentment, planning the day when their father would die and his money would finally be theirs. Andrew must have felt it, the hatred that thickened the air of his house. He was not a stupid man, only a cold one. He installed new locks on doors that had never been locked before. He kept his bedroom door locked at night. He carried his keys always, a heavy ring that jangled when he walked. Keys to the house and the barn and his office and his safe deposit boxes. Keys to everything he owned and controlled. The summer of 1892 was brutally hot. Fall River sweltered under a sun that seemed to have forgotten mercy. The heat rose from the cobblestones in waves. The air inside the house on 2nd Street grew thick and stale, smelling of old wood and older anger. Abby moved slowly through her tasks, her face flushed and damp. Andrew walked to his office and back, his collar wilting, his temper even shorter than usual. Emma fled to Fairhaven to visit friends, escaping the house for 2 weeks of relative peace. Lizzie remained. She stayed in her room much of the time, coming down for meals, attending her church meetings, returning to the house that held her like a prison. She was pleasant enough to outsiders, proper and respectable in her pale dresses and Sunday school manner. But inside the house on 2nd Street she barely spoke. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, her face blank, her thoughts locked behind eyes that revealed nothing. And so they lived, the inhabitants of 92 2nd Street, through the first days of August. Andrew with his keys and his ledgers, Abby with her sister's house and her silent resentment, Bridget with her bucket and her scrub brush and her Irish prayers, and Lizzie, 32 years old, unmarried, trapped in her father's house with no inheritance and no escape, waiting for something to break. The house stood narrow and dark in the summer heat, its shutters drawn, its doors locked, its secrets festering in the airless rooms. No one looking at it from the street would have guessed what was coming. It looked like any other house in Fall River, respectable and ordinary, the kind of place where nothing remarkable ever happened. But inside, in the heat and the silence and the locked rooms, murder was already taking shape. It had no form yet, no plan, but it had motive, and it had opportunity, and it had 32 years of accumulated rage looking for a door to open. That door would open on the morning of August 4th. And when it did, the house on 2nd Street would become the most famous crime scene in America, and the name Lizzie Borden would be whispered in the dark for more than a century to come. Chapter 2. A Family of Strangers. The Borden family did not gather for meals like other families. They did not sit together in the evening to read or converse. They did not celebrate holidays with warmth or mark birthdays with affection. They were 4 people living under one roof who had become strangers to one another, bound only by blood and money, and the bitter mathematics of inheritance. Andrew Jackson Borden had built his fortune on the backs of the dead and the desperation of the living. He had started as a coffin maker, learning the carpenter's trade in his youth, then moving into the undertaking business where profit could be made from grief. He had a talent for appearing at the right moment, for offering services to widows who did not know what else to do, for keeping his prices just reasonable enough to seem charitable while ensuring his margin remained healthy. Death was reliable business. People always needed burying. From undertaking, he had moved into real estate and banking. He purchased properties at foreclosure sales, buying cheap from families ruined by the financial panics that swept through New England in the decades after the Civil War. He rented these properties back to working families at rates that kept them perpetually behind, perpetually grateful for his patience when they could not pay on time. He served as a director of the Union Savings Bank and held stock in several textile mills. He loaned money at interest to men who needed it badly and repaid it slowly. By 1892 his wealth was considerable, but his manner of living suggested poverty. He walked to his office on Main Street every morning, leaving the house at exactly 9 o'clock, his tall frame bent slightly forward as if leaning into a wind that only he could feel. He wore dark suits that had been made years earlier and mended many times. His shirts were clean but frayed at the collars, his boots were polished but worn thin at the heels. He looked like a man who had never had the money, not like a man who kept $500,000 in banks and bonds and property deeds. At midday, he walked home for lunch, another habit of economy. Restaurant meals cost money. At home, Abby or Bridget would have food waiting, cold mutton, bread, perhaps some fruit from the pear trees in the yard. He ate quickly and without comment, then returned to his office for the afternoon. He came home again at 5 o'clock for supper, ate again in silence, and retired to the sitting room to read his newspaper until 8 o'clock, when he went upstairs to bed. His life followed this pattern with mechanical precision, day after day, year after year, a routine that varied only for funerals and bank board meetings. He was not a man who inspired affection. His face was long and stern, dominated by a prominent nose and deep-set eyes that seemed always to be calculating value. His mouth turned down at the corners even when he was not frowning. He rarely smiled and never laughed. His voice was low and flat, used sparingly, as if words too cost money and should not be wasted. When he spoke to his daughters, it was to give instructions or deny requests. When he spoke to Abby, it was to complain about expenditures or comment on the food. He spoke to Bridget only to tell her what needed doing, referring to her always as Maggie, never correcting himself, never acknowledging that she had a name of her own. His relationship with his daughters had curdled over the years into something cold and transactional. He had raised them after their mother's death with the same efficiency he brought to his business dealings. They were fed and clothed and housed. They received enough education to be respectable, but not enough to give them independence. When they reached adulthood and remained unmarried, he kept them in his house because moving them elsewhere would cost money, and because their labour as housekeepers saved him the expense of hiring additional help. Emma had long ago accepted her situation with bitter resignation. She was the elder, the one who remembered their mother Sarah more clearly, and she carried that memory like a torch of resentment against the woman who had replaced her. Emma was tall and thin like her father, with the same long face and calculating eyes. She had his coldness without his business acumen, his frugality without his wealth to justify it. She had never been courted, never been kissed, never been offered any life beyond the narrow house on 2nd Street. She managed the household accounts, argued with tradesmen over the pennies, and found what satisfaction she could in small economies and petty victories over Abby. Her escapes came in the form of extended visits to friends in nearby towns. She would pack a small trunk and leave for Fairhaven or New Bedford, staying for weeks at a time in households where people spoke to one another, where meals were pleasant and conversation flowed. When she returned to 2nd Street, her face would harden again within hours, the brief softness of her absence replaced by the familiar mask of resentment. Lizzie was more complex, or perhaps only better at hiding, the same darkness that Emma wore openly. She presented herself to the world as a woman of faith and charity, devoted to Christian service and moral improvement. She taught Sunday school at the Central Congregational Church, a stone building on Rock Street where Fall River's respectable families gathered each week to demonstrate their virtue. She led the children through Bible verses and hymns, her voice sweet and patient, her manner gentle and encouraging. The children liked her. The other church ladies approved of her. She seemed exactly what a spinster daughter of a wealthy family ought to be, dutiful, pious, content with good works. But those who knew her well saw something else beneath the surface. She had been caught stealing when she was younger, twice in shops on Main Street, taking small items, a bracelet, a handkerchief, things she could easily have purchased, but chose instead to slip into her pocket when no one was looking. Andrew had paid the shopkeepers to keep silent, but the thefts had marked her in his mind as unreliable, perhaps even unbalanced. She had fits of temper that came on suddenly, moments when her face would flush and her voice would drop to a cold, controlled fury that frightened even Emma. During these episodes, she would say things that seemed calculated to wound, bringing up old grievances, throwing past slights back in people's faces with precision. Her hatred of Abby had become the organizing principle of her life. She had been only 3 years old when her mother died, too young to remember Sarah's face or voice, but old enough to remember the loss, the empty place where a mother should have been. When Andrew married Abby 2 years later, Lizzie had rejected her immediately and completely. She would not call her mother, she would not accept affection or guidance. As she grew older, the rejection became more elaborate. For years now, Lizzie had not spoken directly to Abby at all. If she needed to communicate something, she would leave a note on the kitchen table, or speak to Bridget and have Bridget relay the message. If Abby entered a room where Lizzie was sitting, Lizzie would rise and leave without a word. The proximate cause of this final rupture had been the matter of the house Andrew gave to Abby's sister. 5 years earlier, in 1887, Abby's half-sister Sarah Whitehead had needed a place to live. Andrew, in a rare moment of generosity, or perhaps at Abby's urging, had purchased a house on 4th Street and deeded it to Sarah. The property was worth several $1,000s. When Emma and Lizzie learned of this gift, they were enraged. Their father had given property to Abby's family, but nothing to his own daughters. They confronted him together, united in their fury, and demanded compensation. Andrew, faced with domestic rebellion, had relented partially. He deeded to the girls a rental property on Ferry Street that had belonged to their mother's family. The property generated modest income and would eventually be theirs to sell or keep, but the gesture came too late to repair the damage. The daughters had seen clearly where they stood in their father's affections. Abby, the interloper, the woman who was not their mother, had influence enough to move him to generosity. They did not. The knowledge poisoned everything that remained between them. After that, the household arrangements changed. Emma and Lizzie stopped taking meals with their parents. They ate their breakfast in the dining room while Andrew and Abby ate in the kitchen. At supper, the same division held. They passed each other in the narrow hallways without speaking. They lived as boarders in a house they would inherit someday. If they could only outlive the people who stood between them and their father's fortune. Abby bore this treatment with the resignation of someone who had long ago stopped expecting happiness. She was 64 years old in the summer of 1892, a heavy woman who moved slowly and breathed with difficulty in the heat. Her family had been poor, and marriage to Andrew Borden had seemed like salvation when she was 37 and facing spinsterhood. She had kept his house for 27 years. She had endured his coldness and his daughter's hatred. She had asked for little and received less. The house her sister lived in was the only significant thing Andrew had ever given her, and even that had turned into a weapon the daughters used to justify their cruelty. She spent her days in the hot kitchen, cooking the meals Andrew demanded, or upstairs in the stifling bedrooms, dusting furniture that never seemed clean, making beds that would be unmade again by evening. She was afraid of the daughters, especially Lizzie. There was something in Lizzie's eyes during their encounters, something flat and cold that suggested an absence of ordinary human feeling. Abby had told her sister that she feared Lizzie might harm her. She had told Andrew the same. Andrew had dismissed her concerns. The girl was high-strung, he said. She would settle down. There was no real danger, but Abby locked her bedroom door at night. She kept her own door locked during the day when she was inside. She avoided being alone with Lizzie when she could. She felt the hatred radiating from the daughter like heat from a stove, and she had begun to believe that hatred might eventually find a physical form. Bridget Sullivan, watching all of this from her position as hired help, kept her thoughts to herself. She had worked in other houses where families fought, where money was tight and tempers were short. The Borden house was worse than most, but not unimaginably so. The work was hard and the atmosphere was poisonous, but she was paid regularly and she had a room of her own. Even if it was a hot attic space she had to reach by climbing narrow stairs, she did her job, kept her mouth shut, and saved what money she could toward the day when she might return to Ireland or marry and have a home of her own. She saw things, though. She saw the notes Lizzie left for Abby on the kitchen table, instructions written in a careful hand that somehow managed to convey contempt even in the formation of the letters. She heard the arguments that erupted suddenly and ended just as suddenly when someone remembered she was in the next room. She felt the tension that filled the house like smoke, making it hard to breathe, making every task feel heavier than it should. She understood that she was living among people who hated each other, people who were waiting for something to happen, though she could not have said what that something might be. The summer heat made everything worse. The house had no ventilation, No way for air to move through the narrow rooms. The windows were kept shut and shuttered against the sun, which meant the interior stayed dark and close, smelling of cooking and sweat and chamber pots that had not been emptied soon enough. Tempers grew shorter. Abby complained of headaches and stomach troubles. Andrew's face grew redder, his breathing more laboured. Lizzie kept to her room as much as possible, coming down only when necessary, her face pale and blank, her movements deliberate and slow, as if she were walking underwater. Emma's departure for Fairhaven in mid-July had changed the balance slightly. With the elder daughter gone, Lizzie was alone in her campaign against Abby and Andrew. She became quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped attending some of her church meetings. She stayed in bed later in the mornings. When she did appear, she looked tired, as if she were not sleeping well despite the long hours in her room. On Wednesday, August 3rd, the day before the murders, the household ate bad mutton for lunch. The meat had been sitting in the heat, kept in the kitchen because the Bordens had no icebox. Andrew considered them an unnecessary expense. By the time it was served, the mutton was beginning to turn, giving off a faint smell of spoilage that should have warned them away. But waste was sin in Andrew Borden's house, and the mutton was eaten. By evening, everyone in the house was sick. Abby vomited through the night. Bridget had cramps and diarrhea. Andrew's face turned grey. Lizzie moved through the house, pale and quiet, her hand pressed to her stomach. Abby, frightened by the severity of her illness, became convinced they had been poisoned. The next morning, Thursday, August the 4th, she crossed the street to visit Dr. Bowen and told him of her suspicions. Someone had poisoned the family, she said. Someone wanted them dead. Dr. Bowen, who had known the Bordens for years, dismissed her fears as the product of food poisoning and summer nerves. He gave her some powders for her stomach and sent her home. Abby returned to the house on 2nd Street at approximately 8 o'clock Thursday morning. Andrew had already left for his office. Bridget was washing the windows, still feeling sick but working through it because work was what maids did. Lizzie was somewhere upstairs, in her room or in the guest room or the attic. No one was quite sure. The house was hot and cool, and except for the sound of Bridget's rag moving across the glass. It was going to be another scorching day, the kind of day when tempers snapped over nothing. The kind of day when something that had been waiting a long time to happen might finally break through the surface and become real. The house on 2nd Street held its breath in the morning heat, and in a few hours it would begin to scream. Chapter 3. The morning of August 4th. Thursday, August 4th, 1892 began like every Thursday before it, with heat and routine and the small miseries of a household where no one spoke except to give orders or make complaints. The sun rose over Fall River at 5:30, already warm, promising another day of airless, oppressive heat that would make the narrow house on 2nd Street feel like an oven by afternoon. Bridget Sullivan woke in her attic room with her stomach still churning from the bad mutton, her head aching, her body reluctant to move. But maids did not have the luxury of staying in bed when they felt unwell. She rose, dressed in her dark uniform and white apron, and climbed down the steep stairs to begin her day. The kitchen was stuffy and dim. Bridget opened the back door to let in what air she could, then set about lighting the stove. The cast-iron range took time to heat properly, and breakfast needed to be ready when Mr. Borden came down. She pumped water from the kitchen sink and put the kettle on to boil. She took eggs from the pantry and bread from the bread box. Her hands moved through the familiar motions while her mind drifted back to Ireland, to the cool green dampness of County Cork, so far from this hot, angry house where she had somehow ended up. Abby Borden came down first, as she usually did, moving heavily down the stairs, one hand on the railing, breathing hard by the time she reached the kitchen. Her face was pale and puffy from the night's illness. She said good morning to Bridget without looking at her, then sat at the kitchen table while Bridget prepared her breakfast. They did not speak beyond the necessary words. Abby was not unkind to Bridget, but neither was she warm. She treated the maid the way wealthy women treated servants, as useful objects that required occasional direction, but not real engagement. Andrew Borden came down at 7:30, his routine as fixed as the sunrise. He had dressed in his usual dark suit, the fabric heavy and hot for August, but proper for a man of his position. He wore a watch chain across his vest and carried his ring of keys in his pocket. He sat at the kitchen table across from Abby and ate the breakfast Bridget placed before him. Bread, coffee, eggs. He read the previous evening's newspaper while he ate. He did not speak to his wife. When he finished, he rose, took his keys and left the house through the front door, locking it behind him with one of the many keys he carried. Lizzie did not come down for breakfast. This was not unusual. She often kept to her room in the mornings, especially on days when she felt unwell or when the household atmosphere was particularly tense. Bridget ate her own breakfast in the kitchen after the Bordens had finished, forcing down bread and tea though her stomach still felt uncertain. Then she began the day's work in earnest. Thursday was window washing day. Bridget filled a bucket with water and vinegar, gathered her rags, and began with the parlour windows. The work was tedious and made worse by the heat and her lingering nausea. She had to reach high to clean the top panes, standing on her toes, her arms aching. The windows faced the street, which meant anyone passing by could see her working. She moved methodically from window to window, inside and out, wringing out the rags, wiping away the summer dust and the sticky residue of coal smoke that settled on everything in a mill city. Abby Borden, meanwhile, had gone upstairs to make the beds and dust the bedrooms. This was usually Bridget's work, but Abby sometimes helped with the upstairs tasks, perhaps because she wanted something to do, perhaps because she did not trust Bridget to do things properly, perhaps simply because sitting idle in the hot house was harder than moving through familiar tasks. She went first to the guest room, the space between her bedroom and the daughters' rooms, a chamber that was rarely used and usually kept locked. On this particular morning, for reasons that would later be questioned and never fully explained, Abby unlocked the guest room and went inside to dust and straighten. Lizzie came downstairs sometime after 9 o'clock, nearly 2 hours after her father had left for his office. She was wearing a light blue cotton dress, simple and appropriate for a hot day at home. Her hair was pinned up, her face was composed and blank, revealing nothing of what she might be thinking or feeling. She spoke briefly to Bridget, mentioning that she had not slept well, that her stomach still troubled her from the previous day's bad food. She moved through to the dining room and ate a light breakfast that Bridget prepared for her. Just bread and coffee, nothing substantial. Bridget, while working on the outside windows now, saw Lizzie through the glass, sitting alone at the dining room table, staring at nothing in particular. There was something unsettling about the stillness of her, the way she sat without moving, without reading or sewing or doing any of the small tasks women usually filled their time with. She simply sat, her hands folded on the table, her face turned toward the window, but not seeing anything, lost in thoughts that left no trace on her expression. Andrew Borden returned home shortly before 10:30, earlier than usual. He had been to the post office and the bank, attending to his daily business, and perhaps the heat had driven him home sooner than normal. He approached the front door and found it locked, as he had left it. He took out his keyring and began trying keys, but the door would not open. Someone had bolted it from the inside, engaging the extra lock that required a key from within. He stood on the front step, rattling the door, growing annoyed at the delay. Inside, Bridget heard the noise. She was in the side yard, washing the outer windows, but the sound of someone struggling with the lock carried in the morning quiet. She went around to the front of the house and saw Mr. Borden on the step. He looked hot and irritated, his face red, his collar damp with sweat. Bridget hurried to let him in, climbing the front steps, fumbling with the bolts and locks. As she worked at the mechanism, she heard something behind her. A laugh, low and brief. She turned her head and saw Lizzie standing at the top of the stairs, visible through the screen door, watching her struggle with the locks. Lizzie was laughing, not loudly to him, just a quiet sound of amusement at Bridget's difficulty, or perhaps at her father's impatience, perhaps at something else entirely. The laugh made Bridget uneasy in a way she could not have explained. She got the door open, and Andrew Borden came inside, moving past her without acknowledgement. A tall old man in a heavy dark suit, carrying his keys and his newspaper, radiating irritation and heat. He went into the sitting room and sat down on the sofa to look through his mail. Bridget returned to her windows. Lizzie came downstairs and spoke briefly to her father, though Bridget could not hear what was said. Then Lizzie went back upstairs or into another room, The house settled into its usual morning silence, broken only by the sound of Bridget's rag moving across glass and the distant noise of carriages passing on 2nd Street. Abby Borden was still upstairs. She had been up there for more than an hour now, moving between the bedroom, dusting and tidying in the stifling heat. She was a slow-moving woman under the best circumstances, and the heat and her lingering illness made her slower still. She worked her way from room to room, unaware that her husband had returned, unaware that the morning was moving toward its terrible conclusion. Lizzie came to the kitchen where Bridget was finishing the inside windows and mentioned that she thought she might go out to the barn to look for some lead fishing sinkers for a fishing trip she was planning. It was an odd thing to say, oddly specific, and Bridget would remember it later because it seemed like the kind of detail someone offers when they want to be remembered saying it. Lizzie stood in the kitchen doorway, not quite looking at Bridget, her voice casual and flat, mentioning the barn and the fishing sinkers and the trip she was planning. Then she went out through the back door into the yard. Bridget, feeling worse by the minute, her stomach cramping and her head pounding, decided she needed to lie down. She had been working since before 6 in the morning and she felt truly ill. She went upstairs to her attic room, lay down on her narrow bed and closed her eyes. The heat under the eaves was brutal, but she was too tired and sick to care. She let herself drift towards sleep, grateful for even a few minutes of rest. Downstairs, Andrew Borden had settled on the sofa in the sitting room. He removed his boots but left his suit coat on. He lay back against the armrest, his long body stretched out on the horsehair cushions, his feet in their socks resting on the sofa. He closed his eyes. Perhaps he was tired from his morning walk in the heat. Perhaps he felt the effects of the previous day's bad food. Perhaps he simply wanted a few minutes of rest before returning to his office for the afternoon. He lay there in the dim sitting room with the shutters closed against the sun, his breathing slow and even, his body relaxed in sleep or near sleep. The house was very quiet. Bridget lay in her attic room, drifting in and out of a sick, uncomfortable doze. Andrew lay on the sitting room sofa, his chest rising and falling slowly. Abby was somewhere upstairs, perhaps in the guest room still, perhaps moving between rooms, dusting furniture that did not need dusting, filling the empty hours of her empty life with small pointless tasks. And Lizzie was somewhere. In the barn, perhaps, looking for fishing sinkers, or in the yard under the pear trees, or in the cellar where the hatchets and axes were kept, or already inside, moving through the house with purpose, her mind made up, her heart hardened to what was coming. The heat pressed down on the house like a hand on a closed mouth. The air inside grew thicker. Time seemed to slow and stretch. Somewhere a fly buzzed against a window screen. Somewhere a clock ticked. Somewhere in the narrow darkness of 92 2nd Street, the final minutes of 2 lives were running out like sand through an hourglass that no one was watching. When violence came, it came in silence. No warning, no shout or argument to alert the neighbours. Just the sudden movement of a blade through air, the wet sound of metal meeting flesh, and the world changing in the space of a heartbeat. Andrew Borden was struck first while he lay on the sofa. One blow, then another, then more, the hatchet rising and falling with mechanical precision, the blade cutting through his face, his eye, his skull, destroying his features so completely that he would become unrecognizable. He never rose. He never cried out. He simply ceased to be in the space of moments, transformed from a living man into a corpse leaking blood onto horsehair cushions in a shuttered room while the summer heat pressed down and the flies gathered at the windows and the house held its breath as if waiting to see what would happen next. Upstairs, Abby Borden had been dead for more than an hour, lying on the floor of the guest room between the bed and the dressing table, her body fallen forward, her skull opened by the same hatchet that had just finished its work below. She had died without warning, struck from behind while she bent to dust or straighten something, given no chance to turn or cry out or understand what was happening. The blood had stopped flowing from her wounds, congealing in the August heat, darkening on the floorboards and the carpet. The flies had found her already. They crawled across her face and into the open wounds in her head, laying eggs that would hatch within hours in the perfect incubator of a corpse in summer heat. The house was silent again. The killing was finished. 2 people who had been alive at breakfast were now dead in separate rooms, murdered with such violence that their heads were barely recognizable as human. The weapon was somewhere close, hidden or discarded, his blade thick with blood and hair and bits of bone. And somewhere in the house the killer stood in the aftermath, breathing hard or breathing normally, hands bloody or carefully washed, mind racing or perfectly calm, preparing for what came next. In the attic, Bridget Sullivan lay on her bed, unaware. She had heard nothing. The murders had been accomplished in complete silence, or at least in silence sufficient to not carry up 2 flights of stairs to a sick woman's ears. She dozed in the suffocating heat, dreaming perhaps of home, while below her the house on 2nd Street became something it had not been an hour before. Not just a place of unhappiness now, not just a house where people hated each other, but a crime scene, a slaughterhouse, a place where the worst thing possible had happened, and no one yet knew it. The clock in the front hall ticked toward 11. The morning light pressed against the shuttered windows. The heat continued to build toward the afternoon's crescendo. And in the terrible silence of 92 2nd Street, history held its breath and waited for someone to scream. Chapter 4. The discovery time moved strangely in the aftermath. Minutes might have passed, or many minutes. The house remained silent. The bodies cooled slightly in the heat, which is to say they remained hot but stopped producing their own warmth, becoming objects now, evidence, no longer people capable of warmth or coldness, or any of the sensations that distinguish the living from the dead. Bridget Sullivan woke from her uneasy rest in the attic to the sound of a voice calling from below. Lizzie's voice. Not shouting, but raised enough to carry up the 2 flights of stairs, penetrating through Bridget's door and into her fevered half-sleep. The voice called her name, or rather called the name the family used for her. Maggie. Come down quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him. Bridget sat up, her head swimming, her stomach still uncertain. The words did not make immediate sense. She climbed off her bed and made her way down the steep attic stairs, holding the railing, moving carefully because her legs felt weak and her vision was slightly blurred. She came down to the 2nd floor landing, then down the main stairs to the 1st floor. Lizzie stood near the front door, her face pale but composed, her voice steady as she repeated the words. Father's dead. Somebody killed him. Bridget looked toward the sitting room. The door was open. She could see Andrew Borden's body on the sofa, lying in the same position he had been in when she went upstairs, but wrong now, terribly wrong. His face was destroyed. Blood covered the sofa and had pooled on the floor beneath his head. Even from the doorway, the violence of it was apparent. This was not a man who had died of natural causes or a sudden heart failure. This was a man who had been attacked with savage fury, struck repeatedly, reduced to meat and bone. Bridget felt the room tilt. She put her hand against the wall to steady herself. Lizzie was speaking again, telling her to fetch Dr. Bowen from across the street, to hurry, to get help. Bridget moved toward the front door, her mind trying to catch up with what her eyes had seen. She went out into the street, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the shuttered house, the heat hitting her like a physical blow. She crossed 2nd Street to the Bowen house and knocked frantically. No answer. She tried the door, locked. Dr. Bowen was not home. She turned and saw Miss Adelaide Churchill standing in her yard next door, watching. Adelaide Churchill was a neighbour, a respectable older woman who knew the Borden family. Bridget called to her, her voice shaking. There's been a murder. Mr. Borden's been killed. Please, come. Miss Churchill gathered her skirts and hurried across to the Borden house, moving with the kind of determined efficiency that some women possess in moments of crisis, when everything around them is falling apart, but their own actions remain clear and purposeful. Adelaide Churchill entered the house and found Lizzie standing in the front hall. Lizzie's face was pale but dry. No tears, no hysteria, just a blank flatness that would be remarked upon later by everyone who saw her in those first minutes after the discovery. Miss Churchill asked what had happened. Lizzie said her father had been killed, that someone had come in and murdered him. Miss Churchill asked where Lizzie had been when it happened. Lizzie said she had been in the barn in the loft looking for fishing equipment, She had come back inside and found him dead. Miss Churchill went to the sitting room door and looked at Andrew Borden's body. She had known him for years, a difficult man but a neighbour nonetheless. What she saw on the sofa barely resembled a human face. She turned away quickly and went back to Lizzie. "Where is your mother?" she asked, meaning Abby. Lizzie hesitated, then said she did not know. She thought she had heard her come in earlier. Perhaps she was out. Perhaps she was upstairs. She said this in the same flat voice as if the location of her stepmother was a matter of complete indifference. By now, other neighbours had begun to gather. Word spread quickly in a residential neighbourhood on a Thursday morning. A murder at the Borden house. People came out of their homes and stood in the street whispering, staring at the front door, waiting for more information. Someone had gone to find the police. Someone else had tracked down Dr. Bowen, who was returning from his morning calls. The house on 2nd Street, which had been so quiet an hour before, was suddenly full of people and noise and the chaotic energy of disaster. Dr. Bowen arrived and went immediately to examine Andrew Borden's body. He was the family physician, a kind man in his 50s who had treated the Bordens for minor ailments over the years. He knelt beside the sofa and looked closely at the wounds. Andrew had been struck multiple times in the head and face with a sharp implement, likely a hatchet or axe. The blows had come from above while he lay on the sofa. There were cuts on his face, his nose was severed, his left eye was cut in half, his skull was fractured in multiple places. Dr. Bowen counted the wounds, 10 or 11 distinct blows delivered with considerable force. The blood had spread across the sofa cushions and dripped to the floor, but it was already beginning to congeal. The body was still warm but cooling. Dr. Bowen estimated that death had occurred within the past hour, possibly within the past 30 minutes. While Dr. Bowen examined Andrew's body, someone asked again about Mrs. Borden. Lizzie repeated that she did not know where Abby was. She might have gone out. She thought she heard her leave. But the front door had been locked when Andrew came home. How could Abby have gone out and locked the door behind her? Bridget, standing nearby, said she thought she had heard Mrs. Borden come in earlier, after going to visit the doctor. Miss Churchill suggested they search the house. If Mrs. Borden was home, she should be informed of what had happened. If she was not home, they needed to know where she had gone. Bridget Sullivan, still feeling sick but moving through the horror with the numb obedience of someone in shock, went upstairs to check the bedrooms. Miss Churchill followed her. They climbed the stairs to the second-floor landing. The doors to the daughters' rooms were closed. The door to Andrew and Abby's bedroom was closed. The door to the guest room, the unused room between the parents' bedroom and the daughters' rooms, was open. Bridget reached the landing and turned toward the guest room. From the doorway, she could see the floor near the far wall, between the bed and the dressing table. She saw the body, Abby Borden lying face down, her large form unmistakable, her dress bunched around her, blood pooled beneath her head and spread across the floorboards. Bridget made a sound, something between a gasp and a cry. She turned and stumbled back down the stairs, calling out that Mrs. Borden was dead upstairs, that there was another body, that both of them had been killed. The house erupted into fresh chaos. More people rushed up the stairs to see. Dr. Bowen climbed up to examine the second body. Adelaide Churchill remained downstairs with Lizzie, who stood in the front hall with the same blank expression, showing no particular reaction to the news that her stepmother had been found murdered. When Miss Churchill asked her if she wanted to sit down, Lizzie said she was fine standing. When someone offered to send for her sister Emma in Fairhaven, Lizzie agreed in the same flat voice. Someone should send a telegram to Emma. Someone should inform the police more officially, not just the patrolman who had already arrived, but the proper authorities, the city marshal, the detectives. Dr. Bowen examined Abby's body in the guest room upstairs. She had been struck from behind while standing, or perhaps while bending over. The first blow had likely killed her, crushing her skull, but the attacker had not stopped with one blow. Dr. Bowen counted the wounds, 18 or 19 distinct strikes, all to the back and side of her head. The skull was shattered. Brain matter was visible. The blood had spread across the floor in a wide pool and had soaked into the carpet near the bed. Abby's body was cold to the touch. The blood had long since stopped flowing and had darkened and partially dried. Dr. Bowen estimated that she had been dead for at least an hour, possibly as much as 2 hours. She had been killed first, well before Andrew, and her body had lain in the guest room while her husband came home, settled on the sofa, and was murdered in turn. 2 bodies, 2 separate attacks, 1 weapon, presumably, though it had not been found yet. The sequence was becoming clear to those gathered in the house. Abby had been killed first, upstairs, struck down while going about some household task. Her body had lain hidden in the guest room while life continued normally downstairs. Andrew had come home, entered the house, settled down for a rest, and been killed in the sitting room. The killer had struck twice, in 2 different rooms, with enough time between the murders for Abby's blood to dry while Andrew's was still wet. The police arrived in greater numbers. City Marshal Rufus Hilliard came, and several officers with him. They moved through the house, examining the crime scenes, questioning the people present, trying to establish what had happened and when. They searched for the weapon but found nothing immediately obvious. They looked for signs of forced entry and found none. The doors had been locked. The windows were shuttered. No stranger could have entered without being heard. And if a stranger had somehow gotten inside, how had they left? Who had locked the doors behind them? The questions turned inevitably to Lizzie. She was the only family member in the house when the murders occurred. Bridget had been upstairs sleeping through both attacks. Lizzie said she had been in the barn loft looking for fishing sinkers. How long had she been in the barn? 15 minutes, perhaps 20. When had she gone out? Around 10:30 or a bit after. When had she found her father's body? When she came back inside, probably around 11. Had she seen anyone? No. Had she heard anything unusual? No. Where was she when her stepmother was killed? She did not know when her stepmother was killed. She had not known her stepmother was even dead until Bridget found the body. Marshal Hilliard looked at this young woman in her blue dress, standing in the hall of her father's house, surrounded by neighbours and police and the growing crowd of curious onlookers gathering in the street. She was calm, perhaps too calm. She was cooperative, answering questions in a steady voice. But there was something wrong in the picture. Her father and stepmother had been butchered in their own home, their skulls smashed, their blood soaking into the furniture and floorboards, and Lizzie showed no emotion at all. No tears, no shock, no horror, just a blank, flat affect, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the violent deaths of the 2 people who had raised her. The house on 2nd Street had become a carnival of death. People crowded in the front hall and parlour. Neighbours stood in the yard. Curious citizens gathered on the street outside, craning their necks to see, whispering among themselves. The news was already spreading through Fall River. The wealthy banker Andrew Borden and his wife had been murdered in their home in broad daylight, hacked to death with an axe. No suspect yet identified, no weapon found, just 2 bodies growing cold in the August heat and a daughter who claimed she had been in the barn and heard nothing. Dr. Bowen gave Lizzie some medication to calm her nerves, though she did not seem particularly agitated. Someone found a rocking chair and encouraged her to sit. She sat, rocking slowly, while the police searched her home and examined her parents' corpses and asked her questions she answered in monosyllables. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. The murder of Andrew Borden was going to be news far beyond Fall River. This was not some poor immigrant killed in a tenement brawl. This was a prominent citizen murdered in his own home, in the middle of the morning, with his family present. This was the kind of crime that made headlines, the kind of mystery that fascinated and horrified in equal measure. As the afternoon wore on and the heat became unbearable inside the house with all the bodies, living and dead, crowding the narrow rooms, the police began to form their theory. There had been no forced entry, nothing appeared to have been stolen. The violence was personal, excessive, driven by rage rather than profit. And Lizzie's story about the barn was strange. It was the hottest part of the day. Why would anyone climb to a stifling loft to look for fishing equipment? Why had she heard nothing when her father was attacked just below where she claimed to be? Why was she so calm? The investigation had only just begun, but already the terrible possibility was taking shape in the minds of the police and the neighbours and everyone gathered in that house of blood. The killer had not come from outside. The killer had been inside all along, and the killer might still be standing among them, rocking slowly into a chair, her face blank, her hands folded in her lap, waiting to see what would happen next. Chapter 5. The Second Body. The discovery of Abby Borden's body transformed the crime from shocking to incomprehensible. One murder in a locked house was terrible enough. 2 murders, committed separately with time between them, suggested something far more calculated and cold. The killer had not acted in a sudden frenzy and fled. The killer had struck once, waited, and struck again. The killer had moved through the house while Abby's body cooled upstairs and Andrew returned home unsuspecting. The killer had patience and purpose. Dr. Bowen knelt beside Abby's body in the guest room, conducting his examination while police officers and neighbours crowded in the doorway, trying to see into the small chamber where death had come first. The room was perhaps 12 feet square, furnished simply with a bed, a dressing table, a small bureau. It was rarely used, kept for guests who almost never came, locked most of the time because the Borden saw no reason to heat or maintain a space that served no daily function. On this particular morning, for reasons no one could quite explain, Abby had unlocked the door and entered to dust or tidy or perform some task that had placed her with her back to the doorway when the killer approached. She had been struck from behind and above. The first blow had come down on the back of her skull with devastating force, fracturing the bone, driving fragments into her brain, likely killing her instantly or rendering her immediately unconscious. But the attacker had not stopped with that first blow. The hatchet, and Dr. Bowen was certain now it was a hatchet, the wounds were consistent with that particular implement, had risen and fallen again and again, 18 times, 19 times. The doctor counted carefully, distinguishing separate impacts from places where wounds overlapped. The back of Abby's head was destroyed, the skull shattered. The scalp split in multiple places, the blood and brain matter spread across the floorboards in a wide, dark pool. The violence was excessive, far beyond what was needed to kill. This was not the work of someone merely eliminating an obstacle. This was rage given physical form. This was hatred acting through the medium of sharpened steel and muscular force. Each blow after the first was unnecessary for death, but necessary perhaps for something else. Satisfaction, completion, the working out of years of accumulated poison. Abby had fallen forward after the first few blows, her large body collapsing between the bed and the dressing table. The attacker had continued striking her even after she was down, even after she was clearly dead, the hatchet chopping into the back of her head and neck with mechanical repetition. Her blood had sprayed in an arc across the floorboards and onto the side of the bed. It had pooled beneath her head and soaked into the carpet. By the time the attack ended, Abby Borden had ceased to be a person and had become simply a body, a thing that would need to be photographed and examined and eventually removed. The condition of the blood told de Bowen something important about timing. Blood flows freely from head wounds when the heart is still pumping. It spreads and pools and remains liquid for a period of time depending on temperature and humidity and other factors. Then it begins to coagulate, to thicken and darken, eventually drying to a crust. The blood beneath Abby's body had dried considerably. The pool had darkened and the edges had begun to form a thick skin. When Dr. Bowen touched it carefully with his finger, it was tacky rather than liquid. He estimated that Abby had been dead for at least 90 minutes, perhaps as long as 2 hours. She had been killed sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, while Andrew was still at his office, while Bridget was washing windows, while Lizzie was somewhere in the house doing whatever Lizzie had been doing. This timing created a problem for understanding what had happened. Abby had been killed first, well before Andrew. Her body had lain in the guest room for more than an hour while life continued normally in the house below. Bridget had been washing windows, moving in and out of the house, climbing stairs, working in rooms adjacent to where Abby's corpse was cooling. Lizzie had been somewhere, in her room, in the kitchen, in the yard, in the barn. Andrew had returned home around 10:30. had been let in the front door by Bridget, had settled on the sitting room sofa to rest. During all of this ordinary domestic movement, Abby's body had lain undiscovered in the guest room, her blood drying, the flies finding her through the summer heat. Then, sometime around 11 o'clock, Andrew had been attacked and killed in the sitting room. The same weapon, presumably, though it had not been found. The same level of violence, though fewer blows, 10 or 11 to Andrew compared to 18 or 19 to Abby. The same devastating destruction of the skull and face. But why? Why kill them separately? Why wait between murders? Why not strike them both together, or in quick succession, minimizing the risk of discovery? The answer suggested by the crime scene was chilling in its implications. The killer had waited because the killer could wait. The killer was not afraid of being discovered because the killer belonged in the house. The killer had moved between the murders with confidence, perhaps cleaning the weapon, perhaps changing clothes if blood had splattered, perhaps sitting calmly in another room while Abby's body cooled upstairs and Andrew returned home. The killer had struck again only when opportunity presented itself. Andrew alone in the sitting room, Bridget outside or upstairs, no witnesses to see the blade fall. The police searched the house systematically now, looking for the weapon and for any other evidence that might explain what had happened. They examined every room, opened every closet and cupboard, looked under beds and behind furniture. In the cellar they found several axes and hatchets, tools that might be found in any household of the period. They collected these carefully, looking for bloodstains, finding nothing obvious on first examination. One hatchet had a broken handle and appeared to have been recently cleaned, but whether recently meant that morning or last week was impossible to determine without more detailed analysis. They searched the barn where Lizzie claimed to have been during her father's murder. The barn was a small structure behind the house used for storage rather than animals. The ground floor held various household items, tools, old furniture. A ladder led to a loft above, a space filled with dust and heat and cobwebs. The police climbed up to examine the loft. The dust on the floor was thick and undisturbed. There were no footprints visible, no sign that anyone had walked there recently. The heat under the roof was almost unbearable, the air stifling and dead. It seemed unlikely that anyone would voluntarily spend 15 or 20 minutes in such a space on the hottest morning of summer, searching for fishing equipment that could easily have been located elsewhere or left for a cooler day. Marshall Hilliard stood in the loft, sweating, breathing the dead air, and thought about Lizzie's story. She said she'd come out here around 10:30, after her father returned home. She said she had been looking for lead sinkers for a fishing trip. She said she had been up here in this suffocating heat for 15 or 20 minutes. During that time, her father had been attacked and killed in the sitting room, struck at least 10 times with a hatchet, his blood spreading across the sofa and floor, and she had heard nothing, seen nothing. Come back into the house to find him dead. It was possible, technically. The barn was perhaps 30 feet from the house. The doors and windows were closed because of the heat. Perhaps the sounds of the attack had not carried. Perhaps Lizzie truly had been out here, truly had heard nothing, truly had returned to find her father murdered. But the more Marshall Hilliard stood in that airless loft, the less plausible the story seemed. Everything about it felt wrong, the timing, the location, the implausibility of anyone choosing to be in this space on this day. Back in the house, the police questioned Bridget Sullivan more thoroughly. She was clearly sick, her face pale and drawn, her hands shaking slightly. But she answered their questions as clearly as she could. She had been washing windows all morning. She had seen Mrs. Borden go upstairs sometime after 9 o'clock. She had not seen her come back down. She had let Mr. Borden in the front door around 10:30. She had seen Miss Lizzie briefly in the kitchen, though she could not remember exactly when. She had gone upstairs to her room feeling ill sometime around 10:45. She had lain down for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. She had been wakened by Miss Lizzie calling that her father was dead. Had she heard anything unusual? No. Any sounds of violence or struggle? No. Any sounds of someone moving through the house? No, but she had been feeling very sick and might have drifted into sleep. She had heard nothing until Miss Lizzie called for her. The police asked about the family relationships. Bridget hesitated, aware that what she said might matter, might be repeated in court or in newspapers, but she told the truth as she knew it. The family did not get along. The daughters did not speak to Mrs. Borden. There was tension always, arguments about money and property. Miss Emma had gone to Fairhaven to get away from the house. Miss Lizzie had been quiet and strange in recent days, keeping to her room more than usual. Had Bridget ever heard the threats? Had anyone in the house ever spoken of violence? No, not exactly, but the atmosphere had been terrible. The hatred was real and thick. One living in that house could feel it. While the police worked, the house continued to fill with people. Neighbours came and went, family friends arrived. The undertaker was summoned to remove the bodies eventually, though the police wanted them left in place for now for photographs and further examination. Dr. Bowen stayed close to Lizzie, concerned for her health, though she seemed physically well enough, just oddly flat and emotionless. She sat in her rocking chair, moving slowly back and forth, answering questions when asked, volunteering nothing. Someone had sent a telegram to Emma in Fairhaven. "Your father and stepmother have been killed. Come home at once." Emma would not receive the message until early afternoon, would not arrive back in Fall River until evening. Until then, Lizzie was alone in the house with the police and the neighbours and the bodies of her parents. Adelaide Churchill stayed close to Lizzie, performing the role of concerned neighbour and female companion. She noticed things that would later be recorded in testimony. Lizzie's dress was clean, no blood visible. Her hands were clean. Her manner was composed, perhaps too composed for someone who had just discovered her father murdered. When Miss Churchill suggested that Lizzie might want to wash her face or change her clothes, Lizzie declined. When someone offered her food, she refused. When Dr. Bowen suggested she lie down, she said she preferred to sit. The afternoon heat built toward its peak. The house with its closed shutters and crowded rooms became almost unbearable. The bodies in the sitting room and guest room were beginning to smell slightly. The sweet, sick odour of blood and death in August heat. The flies had found both corpses now and were laying their eggs enthusiastically. Someone suggested opening windows for air, but the police wanted the crime scenes disturbed as little as possible. More officials arrived. The medical examiner came to conduct a more formal examination of the bodies. A photographer arrived with his equipment to document the scene. The process was slow and grotesque. Each body had to be photographed from multiple angles. The wounds had to be carefully documented. The blood patterns on floors and furniture had to be recorded. This was 1892, and crime scene investigation was still a developing science. But Fall River had never seen a murder like this, and the authorities wanted to be thorough. The photographer set up his camera in the sitting room first, pointing the lens at Andrew Borden's ruined face. The flash powder ignited with a bright flare and a puff of smoke. The image was captured on the glass plate. An old man on a sofa, his face destroyed, his blood dark against the light-coloured upholstery. Then the photographer moved upstairs to document Abby's body in the guest room. Another setup, another flash, another permanent record of violence and death. While this grim work proceeded, Lizzie remained in her chair, rocking. Someone had given her a fan, and she moved it slowly back and forth, stirring the thick air. She could hear the police moving through the house, could hear their conversations, their speculations. She must have known that she was the primary focus of their attention. She was the only family member present when the murders occurred. She had no solid alibi. Her story about the barn was weak. Her manner was strange, too calm, too controlled. Any reasonable person looking at the situation would arrive at the same conclusion the police were approaching. If a stranger had not committed these murders, and everything about the locked doors and lack of forced entry suggested a stranger had not, then the killer was someone who belonged in the house, and the only people who belonged in the house that morning were Bridget, who was clearly sick and had been upstairs sleeping, and Lizzie. The afternoon dragged on. The bodies were finally removed, carried out on stretchers covered with sheets, loaded into the undertaker's wagon while the crowd on 2nd Street watched and whispered. The house was searched again, more carefully this time. Every drawer was opened, every cupboard examined, every piece of clothing inspected for bloodstains. The police were looking now not just for the weapon, but for any evidence that would confirm or refute their growing suspicion. In Lizzie's room, they found her closet full of dresses, all clean, all properly hung. They found her bureau drawers neat and organised. They found nothing that suggested guilt, but they also found nothing that suggested innocence. The room was simply the room of a respectable spinster, orderly and plain, revealing nothing of its occupant's inner life. In the cellar, they examined the axes and hatchets again more carefully. One hatchet in particular drew their attention. It had a broken handle, and the break appeared recent. The blade had been wiped clean, but seemed cleaner than the other tools, as if it had been washed more thoroughly. There was a coating of ash on the blade, as if the hatchet had been placed in the ash pile near the stove. Why would someone put a hatchet in ashes unless they were trying to absorb or hide bloodstains? The police bagged this hatchet as evidence. It was not definitive proof of anything, but it was suspicious enough to warrant further examination. By evening, the basic facts of the case had been established. Andrew and Abby Borden had been murdered in their home with a hatchet or similar implement. Abby had been killed first, probably between 9 and 10 in the morning. Andrew had been killed later, probably around 11. The house had been locked. There was no sign of forced entry or robbery. The only people present during the murders were Bridget Sullivan, who had been sick and sleeping, and Lizzie Borden, who claimed to have been in the barn. The police had not yet arrested anyone, but the case was pointing in one direction, and that direction was toward the daughter who sat rocking in a chair, fanning herself slowly, showing no tears for her murdered parents, offering no theories about who might have killed them, simply waiting in her strange calm silence for whatever would happen next. Emma Borden arrived from Fairhaven in the evening, brought home by the terrible telegram. She came into the house where her father and stepmother had been butchered, where the bloodstains were still dark on the sitting room sofa and the guest room floor, where the air still smelled faintly of death despite all the windows now being opened. She found Lizzie in the parlour, still composed, still dry-eyed. The sisters embraced briefly, then sat together, speaking in low voices that the police and neighbours could not quite hear. Emma's arrival changed nothing about the fundamental facts of the case. She had been in Fairhaven all morning. She had an unbreakable alibi. She could not have committed the murders, but her presence seemed to strengthen Lizzie somehow, to provide an ally in the hostile atmosphere of the house that was now half home and half crime scene. Night fell on 2nd Street. The crowd that had gathered outside during the day gradually dispersed. The police remained, still searching, still questioning, still trying to understand what had happened in the morning hours when 2 people had been killed with such shocking violence. Inside the house, the sisters sat together in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of murder, waiting for morning and whatever it would bring. The house on 2nd Street had become famous now. By tomorrow, everyone in America would know the name Borden. The story would spread across the country through newspapers and telegraphs. The wealthy banker and his wife, murdered in their own home, their daughter the only suspect. It would become the crime of the decade, perhaps the crime of the century. And Lizzie Borden, 32 years old, respectable Sunday school teacher, would become the most notorious woman in America, but that was tomorrow. Tonight, she sat in the darkness of her father's house, in the rooms where blood had soaked into wooden fabric, where death had come twice in one morning, and whether she was innocent or guilty, victim or murderer, she gave no sign. Her face remained blank, her voice remained steady, and the terrible question that would haunt Fall River and all of America remained unanswered. Did Lizzie Borden take an axe and give her mother 40 whacks? And when she saw what she had done, did she give her father 41? The children's rhyme would come later, would spread across playgrounds and parlours, would turn murder into macabre entertainment. But the facts were darker than any rhyme. 2 people were dead. Someone had killed them with savage fury, and the house on 2nd Street held its secrets close, revealing nothing, admitting nothing, while the night pressed down and the summer heat refused to break. Chapter 6. The inquest begins. The morning after the murders brought no relief from the heat, no break in the pressure that seemed to hang over Fall River like a physical weight. 2nd Street was crowded again before dawn, curious citizens gathering to stare at the house where the Borden murders had occurred, hoping for a glimpse of something, the daughter, the police, any detail they could carry away and repeat to others. The house itself looked ordinary in the morning light, just another narrow clapboard structure among many similar dwellings. Only the police presence revealed that something extraordinary had happened within its walls. Inside, Lizzie and Emma woke to their first full day as orphans, though the circumstances of their orphanhood made the usual rituals of grief impossible. There would be no peaceful mourning, no private family time to process shock and loss. Instead, the house remained full of officials and investigators, men moving through rooms with notebooks and measuring tapes, still searching for the weapon, still trying to piece together exactly what had happened and when. Marshal Rufus Hilliard had spent much of the night considering the evidence, and he had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Every aspect of the crime pointed towards someone inside the household. The doors had been locked. Nothing had been stolen. The violence was personal, excessive, driven by intimate rage rather than criminal opportunism. Bridget Sullivan had been genuinely sick and had a solid account of her movements. Emma had been miles away in Fairhaven. That left Lizzie. But arresting Lizzie Borden was not a simple matter. She was a respectable woman from a prominent family. She was a member of the Central Congregational Church, a Sunday school teacher, known throughout Fall River for her charitable work. She had no criminal history beyond the shoplifting incidents her father had quietly suppressed years ago. The evidence against her was entirely circumstantial. She was present in the house. Her story about the barn seemed implausible. Her demeanor was strange. But there were no witnesses to the murders. No weapon definitively linked to her, no blood-stained clothing found. Arresting her based on what they had so far would be risky. If the case went to trial and she was acquitted, the police would look incompetent and the real killer, if there was another killer, might escape entirely. So Hilliard decided to proceed carefully. An inquest would be held, a formal proceeding where witnesses could be questioned under oath before a judge. Lizzie would be required to testify, her statements would be recorded, and could be used against her later if inconsistencies emerged. The inquest would either provide enough evidence to justify an arrest, or would clear her and send the investigation in another direction. Inquest was scheduled to begin on Saturday, August 6th, 2 days after the murders. In the interim, the investigation continued at the house on 2nd Street. The medical examiner conducted autopsies on both bodies, carefully documenting the wounds, removing the skulls for detailed examination, measuring angles of impact to determine the height and position of the attacker. The photographer returned to take additional pictures. The police interviewed neighbours systematically, asking about the family relationships, about anything unusual they might have seen or heard on the morning of the murders or in the days leading up to them. What emerged from these interviews was a portrait of a deeply dysfunctional household. Everyone who knew the family confirmed that the daughters did not speak to Abby Borden. Multiple neighbours had heard arguments about money and property. Several people mentioned the tension that seemed to radiate from the house, the sense that something was wrong there even if the specifics were not known outside the family. One neighbour recalled that Abby had expressed fear of Lizzie in recent months, had said she worried that Lizzie might harm her, though this statement was vague enough to be interpreted in various ways. The police also discovered that Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid, a deadly poison, from a local drugstore on the day before the murders. She had told the druggist she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. The druggist had refused to sell it to her without a prescription. This fact, when it emerged during the investigation, added another layer of suspicion. Why had Lizzie wanted poison on Wednesday if she was planning to use a hatchet on Thursday? Or had the poison been her first plan, abandoned when she could not obtain it, replaced by the more direct method of a blade? On Friday, August 5th, the bodies of Andrew and Abby Borden were laid out in the parlour of the house on 2nd Street for viewing. This was standard practice in 1892. The dead were displayed in their homes so that friends and family could pay respects before burial. But the Borden viewing was complicated by the condition of the bodies. The undertaker had done what he could, but Andrew's face was too damaged to be shown. His casket was closed. Abby's casket was also closed. The viewing became a strange formality, people filing past two closed coffins, unable to see the faces of the deceased, knowing only that beneath the lids were the ravaged remains of two people who had been violently murdered. Lizzie and Emma stood beside the caskets, dressed in black mourning clothes, receiving the condolences of neighbours and church members and business associates of their father. Lizzie maintained the same composed demeanour she had shown since the murders. She did not weep. She did not collapse. She stood straight and still, accepting embraces and murmured sympathies with quiet acknowledgement, her face revealing nothing. Some who saw her that day thought her courage admirable, her strength under terrible circumstances a sign of good character. Others found her coldness disturbing, her lack of visible grief unnatural and suspicious. That evening the bodies were removed for burial. The funeral would be held on Saturday morning, August 6th, before the inquest began. The graves were prepared at Oak Grove Cemetery, a respectable resting place on a hill overlooking the city. Andrew and Abby would be buried side by side, joined in death, as they had been divided in life by the hatred of the daughters who survived them. Saturday morning arrived hot and still, the air heavy with humidity that promised storms but delivered none. The funeral was held at the house on the 2nd Street, a brief service conducted by Reverend Buck of the Central Congregational Church. A small group attended, family members, close friends, some church ladies. No large crowd because the circumstances were too scandalous and uncomfortable. Reverend Buck spoke of God's mysterious ways and the comfort of faith in times of trial. He did not mention murder or suspicion or any of the ugly facts that hung over the gathering like smoke. After the service, the caskets were loaded into a hearse and transported to Oak Grove Cemetery. The burial was quick and quiet. 2 graves had been prepared, 2 coffins were lowered into the earth. A brief prayer was offered. Then the gravediggers began shoveling soil over the dead, while the living turned away and returned to their carriages. Lizzie and Emma rode back to 2nd Street in silence. They had 2 hours before the inquest would begin, 2 hours to prepare themselves for what was coming. Lizzie would be questioned under oath. Her movements on the morning of the murders would be examined in detail. Her story about the barn would be challenged. Every inconsistency in her statements would be exposed, and everything she said could be used against her if she was eventually arrested and tried for murder. The inquest was held at the courthouse in Fall River, a stern brick building downtown where justice was administered in cramped courtrooms and narrow hallways. The proceeding was closed to the public but not to the press. Reporters packed the corridor outside the courtroom, notebooks ready, waiting for any such scrap of information they could transform into headlines for their eager readers. Judge Josiah Blaisdell presided over the inquest. He was a local magistrate experienced in criminal matters, known for being thorough and fair. The purpose of an inquest was not to determine guilt or innocence, but to establish the facts of the case and decide whether there was sufficient cause to hold someone for trial. Witnesses would be called one by one. They would be questioned by the prosecutor, District Attorney Hosea Knowlton. There would be no defense attorney present, no one to object to questions or protect the witnesses from aggressive examination. Bridget Sullivan was called first. She testified for several hours, recounting her movements on the morning of August 4th in exhaustive detail. She described the bad mutton they had eaten on Wednesday, how sick everyone had been, how she had felt ill all morning Thursday but had continued working. She described washing the windows, seeing Mrs. Borden go upstairs, letting Mr. Borden in the front door, going upstairs to rest. She described hearing Miss Lizzie call for her, finding Mr. Borden's body, the horror of discovering Mrs. Borden upstairs. Her testimony was consistent and detailed, and by the end of it, Judge Blaisdell was satisfied that Bridget had not committed the murders. Other witnesses followed. Dr. Bowen testified about examining the bodies and his estimates of time of death. Police officers testified about searching the house and finding the hatchet with the broken handle in the cellar. Neighbours testified about the family tensions and Abby's expressed fears. The druggist testified about Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid. Piece by piece, the prosecution built its case, a circumstantial web that seemed to be closing around Lizzie Borden like a net. Finally, on Monday, August 8th, Lizzie herself was called to testify. She entered the courtroom wearing a black morning dress, her face pale but composed. She sat in the witness chair and was sworn to tell the truth. Then District Attorney Knowlton began his questioning. He started gently, asking about her relationship with her father and stepmother. Lizzie answered in a low, steady voice. She had gotten along well with her father, though they had disagreements sometimes about money. Her relationship with her stepmother was cordial. They did not have any particular conflict. This was a lie, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But Lizzie told the lie calmly, looking directly at the district attorney, her expression never wavering. Knowlton did not challenge her directly on this point. Instead, he moved to the morning of the murders. Where was she when her father came home? She was downstairs in the kitchen or dining room. She could not remember exactly. Had she spoken to her father? Briefly. What did she say to him? She could not recall the exact words. Where did she go after he came in? She thought she went outside. To the barn. Why did she go to the barn? To look for lead sinkers for a fishing trip she was planning. How long was she in the barn? Perhaps 15 minutes, perhaps 20? She was not sure. Where in the barn was she? In the loft. What was she doing up there? Looking for the sinkers, eating some pears, looking out the window. Knowlton pressed harder. Was it not extremely hot in the barn loft on an August morning? Lizzie acknowledged it was warm. Did she not find it uncomfortable? Not particularly. Did she find the sinkers she was looking for? No, she did not. So she spent 15 or 20 minutes in a stifling loft on the hottest morning of summer, looking for fishing equipment she did not find for a fishing trip she had not planned, while her father was being murdered in the house. Lizzie's composure cracked slightly. She corrected herself. Perhaps she had not been in the barn that long. Perhaps she had been in the yard first. Perhaps she had only gone into the barn briefly. The story began to shift and change under pressure, details appearing and disappearing, times stretching and compressing. Knowlton moved to other areas. The prussic acid. Why had she tried to buy poison the day before the murders? Lizzie said she wanted to clean a sealskin cape. Did she not know that prussic acid was a deadly poison? Yes, but it was also used for cleaning. Had she cleaned sealskin capes with it before? No, but she had heard it could be done. The testimony continued for hours. Knowlton returned again and again to the barn story, to the timeline of the morning, to the inconsistencies in Lizzie's account. She had told different people different things in the hours after the murders. To some, she said she had been in the barn. To others, she said she had been in the yard. To some, she said she had heard nothing. To others, she said she might have heard a noise but thought nothing of it. Her story kept changing, kept adapting to new questions, kept shifting like sand under pressure. By the end of her testimony, Lizzie looked exhausted, her face drawn, her voice hoarse. She had maintained her composure, but only barely, and her story, instead of providing a solid alibi, had only raised more questions. Where exactly was she when her father was killed? What exactly was she doing? Why did her account keep changing? Why had she shown so little emotion? Why had she tried to buy poison the day before? Judge Blaisdell listened to all of it, taking notes, asking occasional questions of his own. When the testimony finally concluded, he announced that he would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within a few days. The inquest was adjourned. Lizzie left the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding the reporters who shouted questions at her. She returned to 2nd Street, to the house where her parents had died, where bloodstains still darkened the sitting room sofa and guest room floor. She must have known what was coming. The inquest had not gone well. Her testimony had been weak and inconsistent. The evidence, while circumstantial, was damning. The city of Fall River was convinced of her guilt. The newspapers were beginning to hint at it in increasingly bold language. It was only a matter of time before Judge Blaisdell issued his ruling, and the police came to arrest her. That time came on Thursday, August 11th, exactly 1 week after the murders. Judge Blaisdell announced that there was probable cause to believe that Lizzie Andrew Borden had murdered her father and stepmother. A warrant was issued for her arrest. Marshal Hilliard and another officer went to the house on 2nd Street and formally charged Lizzie with 2 counts of murder. She received the news calmly, with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the ordeal. She was allowed to pack a small bag with necessary items. Then she was escorted from the house, placed in a carriage and transported to the Fall River police station, where she would be held pending trial. Neighbours and curious citizens lined the street to watch her go, whispering among themselves, some believing in her guilt, some protesting her innocence, all fascinated by the spectacle of a respectable woman accused of murdering her own parents with a hatchet. Lizzie Borden, Sunday school teacher and church lady, was now Lizzie Borden, accused murderess. The trial would not begin for nearly a year, not until June of 1893. But her arrest marked the true beginning of the case that would make her famous. The question was no longer whether someone had killed Andrew and Abby Borden. The question was whether Lizzie had done it, and whether the state of Massachusetts could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The house on 2nd Street stood empty now, except for Emma and the servants. The bloodstains remained. The shutters stayed drawn, the doors stayed locked, and inside those walls the ghosts of August 4th lingered in the stifling heat, in the memory of violence, in the terrible silence that had preceded the screaming. Chapter 7. The Accused Daughter. The Fall River jail was a grim brick building on Ash Street. Built to hold drunks and thieves and the occasional violent criminal, it was not designed for respectable women accused of patricide. But in August of 1892, Lizzie Borden became its most famous inmate, and the matron's quarters on the 2nd floor were hastily converted into a cell suitable for a woman of her class and circumstances. The room was small but clean, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a small table. The window looked out over the street, barred but allowing light and air. It was a far cry from the house on 2nd Street, but it was also a far cry from the common cells below, where male prisoners were held in conditions that approached medieval. Lizzie was to be treated with the deference accorded to her social position, even though she stood accused of the most heinous crime imaginable. She settled into her confinement with the same eerie composure she had displayed since the murders. She read her Bible. She wrote letters to Emma and to church friends. She received visitors, her sister, her attorney, various supporters who believed in her innocence and wanted to offer comfort. She maintained her innocence absolutely and consistently. She had not killed her father and stepmother. She had been in the barn when her father died and had no idea where her stepmother was. Someone else had committed these murders. She was the victim of a rush to judgment, of authorities desperate to solve a sensational crime and willing to blame the most convenient suspect. Her arrest divided Fall River and eventually divided the entire nation. The case had everything the public loved: wealth, violence, family conflict, and a female defendant whose guilt or innocence seemed to depend entirely on one's beliefs about women's nature and capabilities. Could a respectable Christian woman, a Sunday school teacher, commit such savage murders? Or was she obviously innocent precisely because she was a respectable Christian woman who could not possibly do such a thing? The evidence against Lizzie was substantial but circumstantial. She was the only person with motive, means, and opportunity. Her relationship with Abby was poisonous, years of accumulated hatred over money and property, and the affection of her father who had little enough affection to give. Her relationship with Andrew was complicated. She depended on him financially, but resented his control, his stinginess, his coldness. She had attempted to purchase poison the day before the murders. She had been in the house when both murders occurred. Her story about being in the barn was implausible and kept changing in its details. Her demeanor after discovering the bodies was strange, too calm, too controlled, lacking the natural emotions one would expect from someone confronting such horror. But there was no direct evidence tying her to the crimes. One had seen her commit the murders. No weapon had been definitively linked to her. Her blood-stained clothing had been found. The hatchet discovered in the cellar was suspicious. The broken handle, the coating of ash, the appearance of having been recently cleaned, but there was no way to prove conclusively that this was the murder weapon, or that Lizzie had handled it. Without a witness or physical evidence, the case would rest entirely on circumstantial proof and the jury's assessment of Lizzie's character and credibility. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, a skilled lawyer who understood the difficulty of his task. Proving that a respectable woman had committed brutal murders against her own parents would require more than just evidence. It would require overcoming the jury's natural reluctance to believe such a thing possible. Knowlton would need to paint a picture of Lizzie as someone capable of extreme violence, someone whose outward respectability masked inner darkness. He would need to show motive strong enough to drive a daughter to patricide, and he would need to discredit her alibi so thoroughly that the jury would have no choice but to conclude she was lying. Lizzie's defence was organised by Andrew Jennings, a prominent Fall River attorney who had served as legal advisor to Andrew Borden and knew the family well. Jennings would be assisted by George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts and one of the most respected lawyers in New England. The defence strategy was straightforward. Lizzie was a respectable Christian woman of good character who could not possibly have committed these crimes. The evidence against her was circumstantial and could be explained by innocent circumstances. Her behaviour after the murders was consistent with shock and grief, not guilt. And most importantly, the prosecution could not prove beyond reasonable doubt that she had wielded the hatchet that killed her parents. While Lizzie remained in jail awaiting trial, the investigation continued. The police conducted additional searches of the house on 2nd Street, looking for evidence they might have missed initially. In the cellar, in the coal bin, in the ashes near the stove, they sifted and examined every trace of material, hoping to find the murder weapon or blood-stained clothing or anything that would provide definitive proof of guilt. They found nothing conclusive, but they did find something interesting. In the kitchen stove, among the ashes and partially burned coal, they discovered fragments of fabric. The fragments appeared to be from a dress, pale blue cotton, burned recently. When questioned about this, Emma Borden initially denied knowing anything about burned clothing. Then, under pressure, she admitted that Lizzie had burned a dress a few days after the murders. The dress had been stained with paint, Lizzie said, ruined and no longer wearable, so she had burned it in the stove. A painted dress burned in the days after a brutal murder. The prosecution saw this as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Lizzie had been wearing a pale blue dress on the morning of the murders. Multiple witnesses had seen her in it. If that dress had been splattered with blood during the attacks, she would need to dispose of it. Burning it in the kitchen stove and claiming it was paint-stained would be a logical method of destruction. The defence countered that many people burned worn or damaged clothing in 1892. It was common practice, a way to dispose of fabric that could not be mended or repurposed. The fact that Lizzie burned a dress several days after the murders, in full view of her sister, and with a reasonable explanation, did not prove guilt. If she had killed her parents and her dress was blood-stained, she would have burned it immediately, secretly, not days later with witnesses present. The battle lines were drawn. The trial would hinge on interpretations of ambiguous evidence, on assessments of character and credibility, on the jury's willingness to believe that a Sunday school teacher could become an axe murderer. And underlying everything was the fundamental question of women's nature. Were women capable of such violence? Could the gentler sex commit savage murder? Or were women inherently incapable of such acts, making Lizzie's prosecution a miscarriage of justice based on prejudice and panic? The women's rights movement, still in its early stages in the 1890s, took a complicated position on the case. Some feminists supported Lizzie, seeing her prosecution as persecution of a woman trying to escape her father's control. They argued that Andrew Borden had kept his daughters in virtual imprisonment, denying them independence and agency, and that the real crime was patriarchal oppression, not murder. Other feminists were troubled by the idea of defending a potential murderess simply because she was female. If women wanted to be treated as equals before the law, they could not claim special protection when accused of crimes. The public was similarly divided. Women's groups organised petition drives demanding Lizzie's release. Church congregations held prayer meetings for her soul. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, of which Lizzie was a member, issued statements supporting her, but others, equally vocal, condemned her as a monster who had betrayed the most sacred bonds of family. The newspapers fed this frenzy with daily updates, printing every rumour and speculation, turning the case into a national obsession that dominated parlour conversations and dinner table debates across America. Lizzie herself remained largely silent through all of this. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements beyond her repeated declarations of innocence. She spent her days in the matron's quarters of the Fall River jail, reading, writing letters, receiving her sister and her attorneys, maintaining the same composed facade she had shown since the morning of August 4th. If she was tormented by guilt, she gave no sign. If she was frightened by the prospect of trial and possible execution, she did not reveal it. She simply waited, quiet and still, while the machinery of justice ground slowly toward its conclusion. The preliminary hearing was held in late August and early September, a proceeding similar to the inquest but open to the public and press. The courtroom was packed every day, men and women fighting for seats, standing in the aisles, pressing against the walls to catch a glimpse of the accused murderess. Lizzie sat at the defense table dressed in black mourning clothes, her face veiled, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a grieving daughter, not a criminal defendant. The prosecution presented its case again, more formally this time. Bridget Sullivan testified. Dr. Bowen testified. Police officers and medical examiners and neighbours all took the stand, repeating the story of August 4th, building the circumstantial case against the woman in black. The defence cross-examined aggressively, poking holes in the timeline, challenging assumptions, emphasising the lack of physical evidence. But the judge ultimately ruled that there was sufficient probable cause to hold Lizzie for trial. She would remain in custody until June of 1893, when a grand jury would formally indict her and the trial would begin. 9 months in jail, 9 months of waiting while her attorneys prepared her defence and the prosecution built its case. 9 months of being stared at and whispered about, and of being the most famous accused murderess in America, of maintaining innocence while the world debated her guilt. 9 months of small rooms and barred windows and the constant presence of matrons who watched her every movement, making sure she did not harm herself or attempt to escape. Emma visited regularly, bringing food from outside since the jail meals were barely edible, bringing clean clothes and books and news from the world beyond the cell. The sisters maintained their united front. Emma believed absolutely in Lizzie's innocence, or at least claimed to. She told reporters that her sister was incapable of violence, that she was being persecuted by overzealous authorities, that the real killer remained at large while an innocent woman suffered behind bars. The question of motive remained central to the case. Why would Lizzie kill her father and stepmother? The prosecution pointed to money and independence. Andrew Borden was worth $500,000. Upon his death, that fortune would be divided between his daughters. Lizzie and Emma would finally be free of their father's control, free to live as they chose, free to spend money as they wished. The motive was greed combined with years of accumulated resentment. But the defense countered that Lizzie would inherit her father's money regardless. She did not need to kill him, she only needed to wait. Andrew was 70 years old. He might live another 5 or 10 years, but he would die eventually, and his daughters would receive their inheritance. Why risk the gallows for money she would get anyway? Why commit murder when patients would achieve the same result without danger? The answer, the prosecution would argue, was hatred. Lizzie did not kill for money alone. She killed because she hated Abby, hated her with a passion that had built over 30 years, hated her for taking her mother's place, hated her for the house she gave her sister, hated her for every slight and conflict and moment of friction in that poisonous household. And she killed Andrew because he protected Abby, because he chose his wife over his daughters when property was at stake, because he was the source of the control and stinginess that made Lizzie's life unbearable. The burned dress would become crucial to this narrative. If Lizzie had killed her parents in a frenzy of rage, she would have been covered in blood. The attacks were savage, close range, involving multiple blows. Blood would have sprayed across her dress, her hands, her face. She would need to clean herself and dispose of the evidence. The blue dress burned 3 days later could have been that evidence. The claim of paint stains could have been a fabricated excuse. The very fact that she burned a dress after the murders suggested consciousness of guilt. Unless, of course, she really had a paint-stained dress that really needed to be disposed of and really did burn it for innocent reasons 3 days after the murders. Without the dress itself to examine, without any way to determine whether the stains were blood or paint. The burned fabric remained ambiguous evidence that each side would interpret differently. As autumn turned to winter and winter turned to spring, Lizzie remained in her cell and the case remained in the newspapers. Every development was reported in exhaustive detail. Every rumour was printed and debated. The house on 2nd Street became a tourist attraction, people walking past slowly, pointing, trying to see through the shuttered windows into the rooms where murder had happened. Emma eventually moved out, unable to live in the house where her parents had died, taking rooms elsewhere while the property sat empty and waiting. The trial was scheduled to begin in early June of 1893, in the Superior Court at New Bedford, 20 miles from Fall River. The change of venue was considered necessary to ensure a fair trial, though in truth the entire nation knew about the case and had opinions about it. Finding 12 men who had not heard of Lizzie Borden and the axe murders would be impossible. The best the court could hope for was finding 12 men who did not have fixed opinions and could evaluate the evidence with some measure of objectivity. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared their strategies. The prosecution would present the circumstantial evidence methodically, building a web of motive, opportunity, and suspicious behaviour. The defence would emphasise the lack of physical evidence, the implausibility of a respectable woman committing such savage crimes, and the many alternative explanations for the facts the prosecution claimed proved guilt. And Lizzie would sit in the courtroom day after day dressed in black, her face veiled or composed, maintaining her innocence, trusting in her attorneys and in the jury's reluctance to convict a woman of her class and background without direct proof of guilt. The question that had obsessed America for nearly a year was about to be answered. Or perhaps not answered, but decided, which was not quite the same thing. Guilty or not guilty, innocent or murderer, the daughter who grieved or the daughter who killed. 12 men would make that decision, and history would live with the consequences. The house on 2nd Street waited in silence, its bloodstains fading but never quite disappearing, its rooms empty but not quite vacant. The ghosts of August 4th remained, trapped in the narrow hallways and shuttered rooms, whispering their secrets to walls that would never speak, holding the truth of what happened in that terrible heat on that terrible morning when 2 people died and 1 person walked away covered in blood or covered in innocence, depending on which story you chose to believe. Chapter 8. The Trial of the Century. The morning of June the 5th, 1893, dawned clear and warm over New Bedford, Massachusetts. By 8 o'clock, a crowd had already gathered outside the Superior Courthouse, a dignified granite building that would serve as the stage for what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Men in suits and women in summer dresses pressed against the iron railings, hoping for admission to the courtroom, knowing that only a fraction of them would be allowed inside. The Lizzie Borden trial had captured the imagination of the entire nation, and everyone wanted to witness history being made. Inside the courthouse, the preparations were methodical and sombre. The courtroom itself was not large, perhaps 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with wooden benches for spectators, a jury box along one wall, and a raised platform for the 3 judges who would preside over the proceedings. Massachusetts law required that capital cases be heard by a panel of 3 Superior Court judges rather than a single magistrate. The judges selected for the Borden trial were Chief Justice Albert Mason and Associate Justices Caleb Blodgett and Justin Dewey, all experienced jurists known for their fairness and legal acumen. The prosecution table was occupied by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton and Attorney General Albert Pillsbury, who had taken personal charge of the case due to its prominence. Both men were skilled lawyers, but they faced a difficult task. The evidence against Lizzie Borden was entirely circumstantial. No witness had seen her commit the murders. No murder weapon had been definitively identified. No blood-stained clothing had been found. The case would rest on motive, opportunity, and the jury's assessment of whether Lizzie's behaviour and statements were consistent with innocence or guilt. At the defence table sat Lizzie herself, flanked by her attorneys Andrew Jennings and George Robinson. Robinson was the star of the defence team, a former governor of Massachusetts, a man whose reputation and oratorical skills were legendary. He had taken the case not for money, Lizzie could not pay his usual fees, but out of conviction that a respectable woman was being unjustly persecuted. Jennings, the family attorney, provided detailed knowledge of the Bordens and their affairs. Together they would mount a defence based on character, class, and the prosecution's inability to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Lizzie wore a black dress with a high collar and long sleeves, appropriate for a woman still in mourning for her parents. Her hair was pulled back severely. Her face was pale but composed. She carried a small bouquet of pansies, a gift from supporters, which she held throughout the proceedings as if drawing strength from the flowers. She looked like what she was, a 33-year-old spinster from a respectable family, quiet and proper, more suited to a church pew than a defendant's chair. The first order of business was jury selection. Massachusetts law in 1893 limited jury service to white men who owned property. Women, immigrants without property, and all people of colour were excluded from this fundamental civic duty. The jury that would decide Lizzie's fate would therefore consist of 12 prosperous white men, farmers and merchants and tradesmen, the kind of men who attended church on Sundays and believed in the sanctity of family and the natural order of society. The selection process took 2 days. The prosecution and defence questioned potential jurors about their knowledge of the case, their opinions about women's capabilities for violence, their feelings about circumstantial evidence. Many men were dismissed because they had already formed fixed opinions about Lizzie's guilt or innocence. Others were dismissed because they admitted they could not vote to execute a woman regardless of the evidence. Finally, 12 men were selected and sworn, 12 individuals whose names would be recorded in history: Augustus Swift, foreman, a merchant from New Bedford; John Finn, a manufacturer; Louis Hodges, a farmer; George Potter, a mason; and 8 others, all respectable, all property-owning, all white, all male. The trial began in earnest on the June 6th with opening statements. Attorney General Pillsbury rose first to present the prosecution's case. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, and he spoke in measured tones designed to convey seriousness and certainty. He outlined the facts as the prosecution saw them. On August 4th, 1892, Andrew and Abby Borden were murdered in their home on 2nd Street in Fall River. Abby was killed first, struck 19 times with a hatchet while in the guest room. Andrew was killed later, struck 11 times while sleeping on the sitting room sofa. The house was locked. There was no sign of forced entry or robbery. Only 3 people were present when the murders occurred: Andrew and Abby themselves, Bridget Sullivan, the maid, and Lizzie Borden. Bridget had been sick all morning and had been upstairs sleeping when Andrew was killed. She had no motive to harm her employers. Lizzie, on the other hand, had ample motive. She hated her stepmother with a passion that had festered for years. She resented her father's control and stinginess. She stood to inherit $500,000 upon their deaths. She had attempted to purchase poison the day before the murders. She was present in the house when both murders occurred. Her story about being in the barn was implausible and contradictory. Her behaviour after discovering the bodies was cold and strange. And 3 days after the murders, she had burned a dress in the kitchen stove, claiming it was paint-stained, though no paint stains had ever been documented. All of this, Pillsbury argued, pointed inexorably to one conclusion. Lizzie Borden had murdered her father and stepmother with a hatchet on the morning of August 4th. The evidence was circumstantial, yes, but it was overwhelming in its totality. When all the facts were considered together, when every piece of evidence was examined in context, the jury would have no choice but to find her guilty of murder in the first degree. George Robinson rose for the defence with a different story to tell. He was an older man, dignified and avuncular, with white hair and a gentle manner that inspired trust. He spoke softly, almost conversationally, drawing the jury in rather than declaiming at them. He acknowledged the horror of the crimes. 2 people had been brutally murdered. A family had been destroyed. Justice was necessary and proper. But justice did not mean convicting an innocent woman simply because she was present when tragedy struck. The prosecution, Robinson argued, had built its case on speculation and suspicion rather than evidence. They claimed Lizzie hated her stepmother, but hatred was not uncommon in families and did not prove murder. They claimed she had motive because she would inherit money, but she would inherit that money regardless of when her father died. Why risk the gallows when patience would achieve the same result? They pointed to her attempt to buy prussic acid, but she had explained that she wanted it to clean a sealskin cape, and the druggist had refused to sell it to her, so no poison was ever obtained. They emphasized her presence in the house, but being present did not mean being guilty. They criticized her demeanor as too calm, but people respond to trauma in different ways, and shock can manifest as emotional flatness rather than hysteria. Most importantly, Robinson argued, the prosecution had no physical evidence connecting Lizzie to the crimes. No murder weapon had been found with her fingerprints or blood on it. No blood-stained clothing had been discovered. No witness had seen her commit the murders, or even seen her with blood on her dress immediately afterward. The hatchet found in the cellar was suspicious, but many hatchets were kept in cellars in 1892, and there was no proof this particular hatchet had been the murder weapon. The burned dress was explained by paint stains, and even the prosecution admitted the dress had been burned 3 days after the murders, in full view of Emma and the maid, which suggested innocence rather than guilt. What the prosecution had, Robinson concluded, was a theory unsupported by facts. They wanted the jury to believe that a respectable Christian woman, a Sunday school teacher known throughout Fall River for her charitable work, had suddenly transformed into a savage killer and hacked her parents to death with an axe. This theory defied everything known about human nature and female character. It required the jury to believe that a woman who had never shown violence in her life had suddenly committed the most brutal murders imaginable. It asked them to convict based on suspicion and inference, rather than evidence and proof, and this, Robinson insisted, they must not and could not do. The opening statement set the tone for what would follow. The prosecution would present a case built on circumstantial evidence, asking the jury to connect dots and draw conclusions from ambiguous facts. The defense would attack each piece of evidence individually, offering innocent explanations and emphasizing the lack of direct proof. And underlying everything would be the question of whether 12 respectable men could bring themselves to convict a respectable woman of such heinous crimes. The testimony began with Bridget Sullivan, who took the stand on the afternoon of June 6th. She had testified at the inquest and preliminary hearing, and her story had not changed. She recounted August 4th in careful detail, the bad mutton, the window washing, seeing Mrs. Borden go upstairs, letting Mr. Borden in the front door feeling sick and going to her room to rest. She described hearing Lizzie call for her, finding Mr. Borden's body. The horror of discovering Mrs. Borden upstairs. Under cross-examination, she acknowledged that she had liked working for the Bordens despite the household tensions, yet she had no reason to harm them, that she had been genuinely ill on the morning of the murders. The defense tried to suggest that Bridget herself might have committed the crimes, but this line of questioning went nowhere. Bridget's illness was well documented. She had been seen by neighbours throughout the morning looking pale and unwell. She had no motive. And her genuine distress upon discovering the bodies was remembered by everyone who had been present that day. Dr. Bowen testified next, describing the wounds and his estimates of time of death. Abby had been killed first, probably between 9 and 9:30 in the morning. Andrew had been killed later, probably between 10:30 and 11. The weapon was almost certainly a hatchet or similar implement. The violence had been extreme, far beyond what was necessary to kill. Under cross-examination, Dr. Bowen acknowledged that he could not say with absolute certainty when the murders occurred, that his estimates were based on the condition of the blood in the bodies, which was not an exact science. The medical examiner testified about the autopsies he had performed, describing the wounds in clinical detail that made several spectators in the courtroom feel faint. He had removed both skulls and examined them carefully. Andrew had been struck at least 10 times, possibly 11. Abby had been struck at least 18 times, possibly 19. The attacker had used considerable force. The blade had penetrated deeply, fracturing bone, cutting through scalp and brain tissue. Police officers testified about searching the house and finding the hatchet in the cellar. The hatchet had a broken handle and appeared to have been cleaned recently. There was a coating of ash on the blade. Under cross-examination, the defense emphasized that no blood had been found on the hatchet, that the handle could have been broken at any time, that many people kept hatchets in their cellars and cleaned them regularly. Neighbours testified about the family tensions, about Abby's expressed fears, about the arguments over property. But under cross-examination, most admitted they had not witnessed any specific threats or violent behaviour. They had heard arguments, yes, but many families argued. They had sensed tension, but tension was not evidence of murder. The druggist testified about Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid on August 3rd, the day before the murders. He described how she had come to his shop and asked for the poison, claiming she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. He had refused to sell it to her without a prescription, as the law required. Under cross-examination, the defense pointed out that Lizzie had made no attempt to hide her identity or her purpose, that she had given her real name and a plausible explanation, that seeking to purchase something legally and being refused was not evidence of criminal intent. The prosecution called Alice Russell, a friend of Lizzie's who had stayed at the house on 2nd Street in the days after the murders. Alice testified about seeing Lizzie burn a dress in the kitchen stove on Sunday morning, August 7th, 3 days after the murders. Lizzie had said the dress was stained with paint and was no longer wearable. Emma had been present and had not objected. Alice had felt uneasy about the burning, but had not said anything at the time. This testimony was damaging. Why would Lizzie burn a dress 3 days after the murders if not to destroy evidence? The prosecution argued that the dress had been blood-stained, not paint-stained, and that Lizzie had waited a few days before destroying it to avoid suspicion. The defense countered that burning old clothing was common practice, that Lizzie had done it openly with witnesses present, that she had given a reasonable explanation, and that if the dress had been blood-stained from committing murder, she would have destroyed it immediately and secretly, not days later in front of her sister and a friend. The prosecution rested its case after a week of testimony. They had presented their circumstantial web, motive, opportunity, suspicious behaviour, the attempt to buy poison, the burned dress, the implausible barn story. They had shown that Lizzie was the only person with reason and chance to commit the murders. They had painted a picture of a woman driven by hatred and greed to kill her parents in their own home, but they had not produced a murder weapon definitively linked to Lizzie. They had not found blood-stained clothing. They had not presented a single witness who saw her commit the crimes or saw her with blood on her dress immediately afterward. Everything in their case required inference and interpretation. Everything depended on the jury believing that the circumstantial evidence, taken as a whole, proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense opened its case on June the 13th. Robinson called character witnesses first, a parade of respectable Fall River citizens who testified to Lizzie's good reputation. Ministers and church ladies and teachers all took the stand to say that Lizzie was kind, charitable, devoted to Christian service, incapable of violence. She taught Sunday school faithfully. She visited the sick. She participated in temperance work. She was everything a respectable woman should be. The prosecution could not effectively attack these witnesses. They were telling the truth about Lizzie's public persona. But the prosecution argued that outward respectability did not preclude inner darkness, that many criminals had seemed respectable until their crimes were discovered. That character evidence did not override physical evidence and suspicious behaviour. The defence called Emma Borden, who testified that her sister was innocent, that the family tensions had been exaggerated, that Lizzie had had no reason to harm their father or stepmother. Under cross-examination, Emma admitted that she and Lizzie had not spoken to Abby for years, that they had eaten meals separately from their parents, that the household had been unhappy. But she insisted this did not mean Lizzie was capable of murder. The defense presented its own expert witnesses to challenge the prosecution's timeline and medical evidence. Some doctors testified that determining time of death from blood coagulation was unreliable, that Abby could have been killed later than the prosecution claimed, which would weaken the case against Lizzie. Other experts testified that the violence of the attack suggested a male assailant, that a woman would not have the strength to inflict such devastating wounds. The prosecution countered that hatred could give strength, that adrenaline could enable extraordinary physical feats, that women were perfectly capable of wielding hatchets if sufficiently motivated. Through all of this, Lizzie sat quietly at the defense table, her face composed, occasionally wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, though few tears were observed, holding her bouquet of pansies, the picture of wronged innocence. The defense did not call her to testify. In 1893, defendants in criminal trials were not required to take the stand, and the decision not to testify could not be held against them. Robinson had decided that putting Lizzie on the stand was too risky. Her inquest testimony had been problematic, full of contradictions and inconsistencies. Under aggressive cross-examination, she might crack, might say something damaging, might reveal emotions or knowledge that would undermine her claim of innocence. So Lizzie remained silent, letting her attorneys speak for her, trusting in their skill and the jury's reluctance to convict a respectable woman without direct proof of guilt. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Closing arguments began on June 19th. Attorney General Pillsbury spoke first for the prosecution, summarising the evidence, asking the jury to use their common sense and reason. All the facts pointed to Lizzie's guilt. She had motive, opportunity, and no credible alibi. She had acted suspiciously before and after the murders. She had tried to buy poison. She had burned a dress. Her story about the barn was implausible. No stranger could have committed these crimes in a locked house without being seen or heard. The only logical conclusion was that Lizzie Borden had murdered her parents, and justice required that she be held accountable. George Robinson spoke last for the defence, and his closing argument was a masterpiece of oratory and emotional appeal. He spoke for hours, his voice rising and falling, drawing the jury into the story he wanted them to believe. Lizzie Borden was not a murderer. She was a victim of circumstance, of prejudice, of authorities desperate to solve a sensational crime. The prosecution had presented no direct evidence of guilt. They had only speculation and inference. They asked the jury to convict based on suspicion rather than proof, but suspicion was not enough. The law required proof beyond reasonable doubt, and the prosecution had not met that burden. Could the jury convict a respectable Christian woman of murdering her parents based solely on circumstantial evidence? Could they send her to the gallows based on inferences and theories? Could they live with themselves if they were wrong? Robinson's voice broke with emotion as he concluded. He asked the jury to look at Lizzie, to see her as she truly was. A daughter grieving for her murdered parents, not a monster who had killed them. He asked them to remember that reasonable doubt meant acquittal, that when evidence could be interpreted in different ways, they must interpret it in favour of the defendant. He asked them to do justice, which meant recognising that the prosecution had failed to prove its case. The judges gave their instructions to the jury on June 20th. They explained the law of murder, the requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt, the proper way to evaluate circumstantial evidence. Then the 12 men retired to deliberate. The courtroom waited. Lizzie waited. The nation waited. The question that had obsessed America for nearly a year was about to be answered. Guilty or not guilty? Murderess or victim? The jury held Lizzie's life in their hands, and soon they would open those hands and reveal what they had decided. Chapter 9. The Verdict. The jury room was small and airless, the June heat pressing down on the 12 men who carried the weight of judgment. They had listened to 2 weeks of testimony, had examined photographs of the mutilated bodies, had heard expert witnesses contradict each other about time of death and the physics of blood spatter, and the strength required to fracture a human skull with a hatchet. Now they must decide whether Lizzie Andrew Borden, Sunday school teacher and daughter of one of Fall River's wealthiest citizens, had murdered her father and stepmother in cold blood. Augustus Swift, the foreman, was a merchant from New Bedford, a practical man accustomed to weighing evidence and making decisions. He called for an initial vote to see where the jury stood. The result was not what anyone had expected after 2 weeks of damning circumstantial evidence. The first vote was 10 for acquittal, 2 undecided, 0 for conviction. Not a single juror believed beyond reasonable doubt that Lizzie had committed the murders. The discussion that followed was brief and decisive. The two undecided jurors had concerns about the burned dress and Lizzie's attempt to purchase poison, but they acknowledged that neither piece of evidence proved murder. Many respectable people burned damaged clothing. Attempting to buy something legally and being refused was not a crime. As for the implausible barn story, implausible was not the same as impossible. Perhaps Lizzie really had been in the barn. Perhaps she really had heard nothing. Perhaps her story changed because she was traumatized and confused, not because she was lying. What the prosecution had not provided was any direct evidence linking Lizzie to the murders. No one had seen her commit the crimes. No blood-stained clothing had been found. No murder weapon had been definitively connected to her. The hatchet in the cellar was suspicious, but proved nothing. The household tensions provided motive, but many families had tensions without resorting to murder. Lizzie's calm demeanor after discovering the bodies was strange, but people responded to trauma in different ways. Most importantly, the jurors found it almost impossible to believe that a respectable Christian woman could have committed such savage violence. The murders had been brutal beyond necessity. 19 blows to Abby's head, 11 to Andrew's. This was not the work of someone coolly eliminating obstacles. This was rage, hatred, fury given physical form. Could a Sunday school teacher who had never shown violence in her life suddenly become capable of such monstrous acts? The jurors, all respectable men themselves, all believers in the natural order of society and the inherent gentleness of proper women, could not make themselves believe it. The circumstantial evidence, taken individually, could all be explained by innocent circumstances. Taken together, it created suspicion but not certainty, and the law required certainty beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution had created doubt, but they had not eliminated it. Therefore, acquittal was the only proper verdict. After just over an hour of deliberation, the jury was ready. They informed the bailiff, who notified the judges, who ordered the courtroom reconvened. Word spread quickly through the courthouse and into the streets outside. The jury had reached a verdict. After less than 90 minutes of deliberation, they had decided Lizzie Borden's fate. The courtroom filled rapidly, spectators fighting for seats, reporters positioning themselves for the best view, artists preparing to sketch the moment for newspapers that would rush the images into print for the next day's editions. Lizzie was brought in from the adjacent room where she had been waiting with her attorneys. She looked pale but composed, her black dress severe, her face half hidden behind a veil. She took her seat at the defense table and clasped her hands together. The pansies she had carried throughout the trial now wilted and discarded. The three judges entered and took their places on the bench. The jury filed in, their faces revealing nothing. Augustus Swift, the foreman, stood with a piece of paper in his hand, the verdict form that would determine whether Lizzie lived or died. Chief Justice Mason asked the traditional question. "Mr. Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honour." "What say you?" Swift unfolded the paper, though he did not need to read it. The verdict was already fixed in his mind, in all their minds. "We find the defendant, Lizzie Andrew Borden, not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped and cheered. Women wept with relief. Men applauded despite the judge's attempts to maintain decorum. Lizzie herself collapsed back into her chair, her composure finally breaking, tears streaming down her face. Emma rushed forward to embrace her sister. The attorneys shook hands, Robinson's face showing satisfaction at a victory he had expected but could not take for granted until the words were spoken. The judges made no immediate comment. They thanked the jury for their service and formally discharged them. They ordered Lizzie released from custody immediately. Then they adjourned the court, bringing to an end the trial that had captivated a nation. Lizzie left the courthouse a free woman for the first time in 10 months. She had been arrested in August of 1892 and had spent the intervening time in jail awaiting trial. Now, in June of 1893, she walked out into the sunlight, acquitted of all charges, legally innocent of the murders that everyone in America had an opinion about. The crowd outside the courthouse was enormous. Thousands of people had gathered, waiting for the verdict, and now they pressed forward to catch a glimpse of the woman who had been accused of one of the most brutal crimes in American history and had been found not guilty. Some cheered for her, others stood silent, their faces showing they believed the jury had made a terrible mistake. Still others simply stared, curious to see the famous Lizzie Borden in person, to tell their grandchildren they had been there on the day she was acquitted. Lizzie and Emma made their way through the crowd to a waiting carriage. They were driven to the train station and took the next train back to Fall River, arriving in the evening to find another crowd waiting. News of the verdict had spread by telegram, and Fall River was divided in its response. The church communities that had supported Lizzie celebrated her vindication, but others, perhaps the majority, believed she had gotten away with the murder, that her wealth and respectability had protected her from justice that would have been swift and certain for a poor immigrant or person of colour accused of the same crimes. The sisters returned to the house on 2nd Street, but they could not stay there. The house where the murders had occurred, where bloodstains still darkened the floors despite all attempts to clean them, was no place for living. Within weeks, they would sell the property and move to a mansion on the hill, the wealthy neighbourhood where Andrew Borden had refused to live, but where his daughters would establish themselves using the inheritance they had received upon his death. The legal case was over, but the social consequences were just beginning. Lizzie had been acquitted in a court of law, but she would never be acquitted in the court of public opinion. Fall River society, which had been divided during the trial, closed ranks against her after the verdict. The families who had testified to her good character at trial now avoided her on the street. Former friends stopped calling. Invitations ceased. The churches that had supported her quietly made it clear she was no longer welcome in their congregations. The Central Congregational Church, where Lizzie had taught Sunday school and been an active member, asked her to resign her membership. The Women's Christian Temperance Union dropped her from their roles. The charitable organisations she had worked with found reasons why her continued participation was no longer appropriate. She was ostracised, cut off from the social fabric of Fall River, with a thoroughness that must have been devastating for a woman whose entire identity had been built on respectability and community standing. Emma stood by her sister through all of this, at least initially. They moved together to the new house on the hill, a substantial Victorian mansion Lizzie named Maplecroft. It had modern conveniences the house on 2nd Street had lacked: indoor plumbing, gas lighting, a telephone. It was spacious and comfortable, everything Andrew Borden's stinginess had denied them during his lifetime. They furnished it expensively, hired servants, lived like the wealthy women they had become. But the inheritance they had waited for, the money that many believed had motivated murder, brought them no happiness. They were wealthy but alone. They had status but no friends. They lived in a beautiful house that became a kind of prison, a place they retreated to because the world outside had rejected them. Lizzie began using her middle name, calling herself Lisbeth instead of Lizzie, as if changing her name could create distance from the woman accused of murder. She developed an interest in theatre and began attending performances in Boston, where she could be anonymous in the crowds. She befriended a young actress named Nance O'Neill and spent considerable money supporting her career, hosting parties for theatre people at Maplecroft, trying to create a social circle that would accept her when Fall River society would not. These friendships and the money Lizzie spent on them created a new rift between the sisters. Emma disapproved of the theatre people and the parties and the extravagance. In 1905, after living together for 12 years, Emma moved out of Maplecroft and took her own house elsewhere in Fall River. The sisters, who had been united throughout the trial, who had supported each other through ostracism and isolation, had finally separated. They never reconciled. They never spoke again. The question of what really happened on August 4th, 1892, remained unanswered despite the verdict. The jury had found Lizzie not guilty beyond reasonable doubt, but not guilty was not the same as innocent. Many jurors, when interviewed years later, admitted they believed Lizzie had probably committed the murders, but that the prosecution had not proved it to the legal standard required for conviction. Others maintained she was innocent and had been wrongly accused. The ambiguity remained and would remain, because the truth had died with Andrew and Abby Borden in the heat of that August morning. Theories proliferated over the years. Some believed Lizzie had committed the murders alone, driven by hatred and greed. Others suggested Emma had been involved, that she had returned secretly from Fairhaven to help her sister. Still others proposed that Bridget the maid had done it, or that an unknown intruder had somehow entered the locked house. A few suggested that Uncle John Morse, Andrew's brother-in-law who had been visiting that week, was the killer. Every theory had its proponents and its flaws. The physical evidence supported the prosecution's theory better than any alternative. The locked house, personal nature of the violence, the timing that required the killer to be present for an extended period, the lack of robbery or obvious motive for an outsider. All of this suggested someone inside the household, someone who belonged there, someone who could move freely without arousing suspicion. And the only person who fit that description, other than the clearly innocent Bridget, was Lizzie. But proving something in the court of historical analysis was different from proving it in a court of law. The jury had required certainty beyond reasonable doubt, and the prosecution had not provided it. They had provided strong circumstantial evidence, but circumstantial evidence could be challenged, explained, reinterpreted. Without a confession or a witness or physical evidence directly linking Lizzie to the crimes, the case would always remain ambiguous. The burned dress was perhaps the most suspicious piece of evidence. 3 days after murders committed with a hatchet, where blood would have sprayed across the killer's clothing, Lizzie had burned a dress and claimed it was paint-stained. The timing was damning, but the defense had argued convincingly that if Lizzie had murdered her parents and her dress was blood-stained, she would have burned it immediately and secretly, not days later with witnesses present. The fact that she burned the dress openly, with her sister and a friend watching, with a plausible explanation offered, suggested innocence rather than consciousness of guilt, or perhaps it suggested cunning. Perhaps Lizzie understood that burning the dress immediately would be suspicious, so she waited a few days and then burned it openly, creating the appearance of innocence through audacity. This interpretation required crediting Lizzie with considerable psychological sophistication, with the ability to plan and dissemble even in the immediate aftermath of committing brutal murder. Was she capable of such cold calculation? The jury had decided she was not. Others were less certain. The prussic acid remained troubling as well. Why had Lizzie tried to buy deadly poison on the day before the murders? Her explanation that she wanted to clean a sealskin cape was technically plausible, but struck many as suspicious. Prussic acid could be used for cleaning, but it was primarily known as a poison, and attempting to purchase it without a prescription the day before 2 people were murdered seemed like more than coincidence. But again, the defense had an answer. Lizzie had gone to a drugstore in broad daylight, had given her real name, had stated her purpose openly, and had been refused sale because she lacked a prescription. If she was planning murder, would she have been so obvious about trying to obtain poison? Would she not have been more careful, more secretive? The very openness of her attempt suggested innocent intent. Every piece of evidence could be interpreted 2 ways. Every suspicious fact had an innocent explanation. This was the nature of circumstantial cases, the reason they were so difficult to prove. The jury, faced with ambiguity and reasonable doubt, had chosen acquittal. And under American law, acquittal was final. Lizzie could not be tried again for the same crimes. Double jeopardy protected her from further prosecution. Whatever the truth, she was legally innocent and would remain so for the rest of her life. The verdict satisfied no one completely. Those who believed in Lizzie's innocence were vindicated, but recognized that the acquittal had not restored her reputation or social standing. Those who believed in her guilt were outraged that she had escaped justice, but had to accept that the legal system had spoken and could not be overruled. The murders remained officially unsolved. The case closed but never truly resolved. Fall River tried to move on, tried to return to normal life, but the murders had changed the city permanently. The house on 2nd Street became infamous, a landmark of horror that tourists visited to stare at and photograph. The Borden name, once respectable, became synonymous with murder and scandal. and Lizzie herself became a kind of ghost, a living woman who was already passing into legend, her real life less important than the story people told about her. The children's rhyme began circulating within years of the trial, a macabre bit of doggerel that turned brutal murder into playground entertainment. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. The numbers were wrong. Abby had received 19 blows, Andrew 11, and Abby was not Lizzie's mother but her stepmother. But accuracy mattered less than rhythm, and the rhyme spread across America, ensuring that the Borden murders would be remembered long after the participants were dead. Lizzie lived with this infamy for the rest of her life. She remained in Fall River, in the house on the hill, isolated and bitter, wealthy but unhappy. She attended theatre performances in Boston. She maintained friendships with people who were willing to overlook her past or who believed in her innocence. She managed her inheritance and lived comfortably, but she was never accepted back into Fall River society, never forgiven for the suspicion that clung to her like smoke. In her final years, she was alone except for servants and a few loyal friends. Emma was gone, living separately, refusing contact. The church communities had rejected her. The neighbours avoided her. She had the money her father's death had brought, but it had purchased nothing worth having. She died on June 1st, 1927, at the age of 66, from pneumonia and complications of gallbladder surgery. Emma died just days later on June the 10th, as if the sisters could not be separated for long, even in death. They were buried in the family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery, not far from the graves of Andrew and Abby. The family reunited in death, though they had been divided by violence and suspicion in life. The house on 2nd Street still stands, preserved now as a museum and bed and breakfast, a place where tourists can sleep in the rooms where murder occurred, can stand where Lizzie stood, can try to feel what she felt on that terrible August morning. The bloodstains are long gone, cleaned away by time and chemistry. But the questions remain, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Did Lizzie Borden take an axe? The jury said no, or at least said the prosecution had not proved she did. History is less certain. The evidence points in her direction, but does not arrive at definitive conclusion. The truth died with the people who knew it, taking its secrets into the grave, leaving only speculation and story and the endless fascination of a mystery that will never be completely solved. Chapter 10. The House. She bought with blood money. The mansion at 306 French Street stood on a hill overlooking Fall River, a substantial Victorian structure of grey stone and dark wood. Nothing like the cramped house on 2nd Street where murder had made the Borden name infamous. Lizzie had purchased the property within months of the trial, using money from her inheritance. Half of the $500,000 her father had accumulated through decades of ruthless business practice and relentless frugality. She named the house Maplecroft after the maple trees that lined the street, a name that suggested gentility and respectability, qualities she would spend the rest of her life trying to reclaim. The house had everything the 2nd Street property had lacked: indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, gas lighting in every room, a telephone, central heating, spacious rooms with high ceilings and large windows that let in light and air, a modern kitchen, multiple bathrooms, servants' quarters that were actually comfortable. This was the house Andrew Borden could have afforded but had refused to buy, and now his daughters lived in it, purchased with the money his death had brought them. Emma moved in with Lizzie initially, and for a time the sisters attempted to build a life together in their new home. They furnished the rooms expensively, buying furniture and carpets and draperies that would have horrified their parsimonious father. They hired servants, a cook, a maid, a gardener, and lived like the wealthy women they had become. They attended theatre performances in Boston, took trips to Providence and New York, bought fine clothes and jewellery. They were spending the money Andrew had hoarded, enjoying the comfort and luxury he had denied them during his lifetime. But the money could not buy what they really needed. Fall River society had closed ranks against them. The acquittal had been legal, but not social. The respectable families of the Hill, the neighbours who lived in similar mansions up and down French Street, did not call on the Borden sisters. Invitations were not extended. At church services, which Lizzie initially attempted to attend, people moved away from her in the pews, leaving empty spaces around her as if her presence was contaminating. The minister's sermon seemed pointed, emphasizing themes of guilt and judgment and the impossibility of hiding sin from God's all-seeing eye. Within a few months, Lizzie stopped going to church entirely. She had been a devoted member of the Central Congregational Church, a Sunday school teacher, active in charitable work and temperance movements. But that life was finished now. The church had supported her during the trial, had testified to her good character, but after the acquittal the support had evaporated. She was asked quietly but firmly to resign her membership. The Sunday school children she had taught were kept away from her. The Women's Christian Temperance Union removed her from their roles. Every organisation that had defined her respectable identity before the murders now wanted nothing to do with her. The isolation was profound and deliberate. Fall River was not a large city, and social networks were tight and interconnected. When the leading families decided to ostracise someone, the ostracism was complete. Lizzie and Emma found themselves cut off from every social activity, every charity event, every gathering where Fall River's respectable citizens congregated. They were wealthy, but wealth without social acceptance was a kind of poverty all its own. Lizzie responded to this rejection by attempting to create her own social world. She began attending theatre performances in Boston, where she could be anonymous in the crowds and where no one knew or cared about the Borden murders. She developed a passionate interest in drama and opera, spending lavishly on tickets and often attending multiple performances in a single week. In the darkened theatres, watching actors perform the stories of love and betrayal and tragedy, she could forget for a few hours the scandal that defined her real life. In 1904, Lizzie met Nance O'Neill, a young actress whose career was ascending. Nance was beautiful and talented and openly affectionate in a way that respectable Fall River women were not. Lizzie was captivated. She began supporting Nance financially, hosting parties for her at Maplecroft, inviting theatre people to stay in the mansion when they were performing in the area. These gatherings were lively and bohemian, full of people who drank and poked and talked about art and life with a freedom that was shocking to Fall River sensibilities. Emma disapproved deeply. The theatre people were not respectable. The parties were improper. The money Lizzie spent on Nance and her friends was extravagant and wasteful. The sisters argued increasingly about money, about propriety, about what kind of life they should be living. Emma wanted quiet respectability, or at least the appearance of it. Lizzie wanted something else: acceptance, companionship, a life less constrained by the judgment that followed her everywhere in Fall River. The breaking point came in 1905. Emma moved out of Maplecroft and took her own house elsewhere in the city. The sisters, who had been united through murder accusations and trial, who had supported each other through ostracism and isolation, could not live together anymore. The tensions that had simmered for years finally boiled over, and they separated permanently. They never reconciled. They never spoke again. When Emma died in 1927, just days after Lizzie's own death, she had not communicated with her sister in more than 20 years. What caused the final rupture between them was never made entirely clear. Some speculated it was Emma's disapproval of Lizzie's theatre friends and lavish spending. Others suggested deeper conflicts about the murders themselves, about what had really happened on August 4th, about secrets the sisters shared that had become unbearable for one or both of them to carry. Perhaps Emma had always harboured doubts about Lizzie's innocence. Perhaps Lizzie had grown tired of Emma's judgment and disapproval. Perhaps they simply could not live together anymore. Two women bound by blood and history and suspicion, unable to escape each other's company, until separation became the only option. After Emma left, Lizzie lived alone at Maplecroft except for her servants. She continued attending theatre performances in Boston. She maintained friendships with a few people who were willing to accept her, mostly theatre people, artists, people on the margins of respectable society who did not judge her for her past or perhaps found her notoriety interesting rather than repellent. She managed her considerable wealth carefully, investing in real estate and stocks, ensuring that she would remain financially secure for the rest of her life. But she never escaped the shadow of the murders. Fall River would not let her forget. Children were taught to avoid walking past her house. Parents used her as a cautionary tale. Behave yourself or you might grow up to be like Lizzie Borden. Tourists began visiting Fall River specifically to see the house where the murders occurred, and to catch a glimpse of the woman accused of committing them. Reporters periodically tried to interview her, asking if she would finally admit what really happened, if she would confess or provide any information that might settle the question of her guilt or innocence. She refused all such requests. She maintained her silence absolutely. If she had secrets, she kept them. The house on 2nd Street, which Lizzie and Emma had sold shortly after the trial, passed through various owners over the years. Some tenants reported strange occurrences, sounds in the night, doors opening by themselves, cold spots in the guest room where Abby had died. Skeptics dismissed these reports as imagination fed by knowledge of the murders. Believers suggested that the violent deaths had left some psychic residue, that the house itself remembered what had happened within its walls. Lizzie herself was sometimes seen walking the streets of Fall River, usually in the evening, usually alone. She was a tall woman who had grown heavier with age, dressed always in black or dark colours, her face set in an expression that discouraged conversation. Children would see her and run. Adults would cross the street to avoid her. She moved through the city like a ghost, present but not really part of the community, wealthy but isolated, living but not truly alive. She developed health problems as she aged. Gallbladder trouble that required surgery, pneumonia that weakened her lungs. The complications of old age made worse by loneliness and isolation. She was 66 years old in 1927 when her health finally failed completely. She died at Maplecroft on June the 1st, attended by servants and a doctor, but no family, no friends, no one who truly cared about her beyond professional duty. Emma died just 9 days later, on June 10th, in her own home in Newmarket, New Hampshire, where she had been living in her final years. The timing seemed almost supernatural, as if the sisters could not be separated for long, even in death. They had lived apart for more than 20 years, had not spoken in all that time, but they died within days of each other, as if bound by threads that distance could not break. Both sisters were buried in the family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery, alongside their father Andrew, their stepmother Abby, and their mother Sarah, who had died when they were children. The family that had been divided by violence and suspicion and hatred was reunited in death, all their conflicts and secrets buried with their bones in the earth of Fall River. Lizzie's will revealed that she had left substantial bequests to the Animal Rescue League and to various other animal welfare organisations. She had always loved animals, had kept dogs and cats at Maplecroft, had been more comfortable with animals than with people who judged her and found her wanting. She left nothing to charity organisations that served people, nothing to the churches that had rejected her, nothing to the city that had ostracised her. Her will was a final statement of her alienation from Fall River society. The estate was substantial, nearly $500,000, approximately the same amount she had inherited from her father 35 years earlier. She had managed the money well, had lived comfortably but not extravagantly in her later years, had ensured that she would never face the poverty or dependence that so many women of her generation experienced. The money brought her independence and security, even if it could not buy acceptance or peace. The question that had defined her life remained unanswered at her death. Did Lizzie Borden murder her father and stepmother with a hatchet on the morning of August 4th, 1892? The jury had said no, or at least had said the prosecution had not proved she did. The city of Fall River, in its collective judgment, had said yes, ostracising her for the rest of her life based on suspicion that never solidified into legal proof. Lizzie herself had said no, maintaining her innocence consistently from the moment of her arrest until her death 35 years later. The truth, if there was a single truth, died with the people who knew it. Andrew and Abby took their secrets to the grave on that terrible August morning. Lizzie took hers to the grave in June of 1927. Emma took hers just days later. Whatever really happened in the house on 2nd Street, whatever rage or desperation or calculation led to 2 brutal murders, remained hidden behind the silence of the dead. The legacy Lizzie left behind was not the charitable work or the church membership or the respectable life she had tried to build before August of 1892. Her legacy was infamy, was the murders that made her name synonymous with patricide, was the children's rhyme that would be chanted in playgrounds for generations. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. The numbers were wrong, but the rhyme endured. The details were distorted, but the essential story remained fixed in American consciousness. Whether she was guilty or innocent, whether she wielded the hatchet or was wrongly accused, Lizzie Borden became an icon of domestic violence, of family dysfunction, of murder hiding behind respectable facades. Her case entered folklore and legend, a tale told and retold until the real woman was obscured by the mythical figure she had become. The house at 306 French Street, Maplecroft, where Lizzie spent 35 years in wealthy isolation, eventually passed to other owners after her death. It remained a private residence, a substantial home on the hill, no longer associated primarily with the woman who had named it. But the house on 2nd Street, the cramped, narrow structure where the murders occurred, became a shrine to violence, a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by true crime and dark history. In modern times, the 2nd Street house has been preserved as a museum and bed and breakfast, a place where tourists can sleep in the rooms where Andrew and Abby died, can eat breakfast in the dining room where the family took their final meals, can stand in the guest room where Abby's body lay hidden for hours. The bloodstains are gone, cleaned away long ago, but the memory remains, embedded in the wooden plaster, in the narrow stairs and shuttered windows, in the very air of a house where death came twice in one August morning. The question endures because it cannot be answered with certainty. The evidence points in directions that can be interpreted multiple ways. The motivations are clear but not conclusive. The opportunity was present but not exclusive. Every fact that suggests guilt can be explained by innocence. Every indicator of innocence can be reinterpreted as cunning. The ambiguity is permanent, the mystery unsolvable. Did Lizzie Borden really take an axe to her parents? History cannot say with certainty. The jury said no beyond reasonable doubt. The city of Fall River said yes beyond social acceptance. Lizzie herself said no until her dying day. And the dead, who alone knew the complete truth, carried that truth into silence. The house on the hill, purchased with inheritance money that might have been blood money, stood as a monument to ambiguity. Maplecroft witnessed the long, lonely years of a woman who was either wrongly accused or got away with murder, who lived in comfort but died in isolation, who had everything money could buy except the one thing she wanted most, her reputation back, her respectability restored, her name cleared of the suspicion that followed her like a shadow until her final breath. The maple trees that gave the house its name grew tall and thick over the decades, their branches spreading over the roof, their leaves casting shadows on the grey stone walls. Inside, the rooms where Lizzie had lived out her exile slowly emptied of her presence, becoming just rooms again, just spaces where new occupants would make new memories, unconnected to the woman who had named the house and hidden there from a world that had judged her and found her wanting. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead inhabit, if they inhabit anywhere at all, Lizzie Borden rests beside her sister Emma, beside her father Andrew, beside her stepmother Abby. The family reunited at last in the democracy of death, where all secrets are finally kept or finally revealed, where judgment belongs to powers beyond human reckoning, where the question of guilt or innocence becomes moot because the crimes and the victims and the accused have all passed into history, into legend, into the permanent mystery of that August morning when 2 people died and the truth died with them, leaving only questions that will never be answered, and shadows that will never lift from the house on 2nd Street or the mansion on the hill. The candles have burned low, the stories have been told, and history once again turns the page in the dark.